Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're traveling to Gilbert, Arizona, a quiet suburban community just southeast of Phoenix, where manicured lawns meet desert landscapes, and families build their lives in the shadow of the Superstition Mountains. It's the kind of place where neighbors wave to each other, where children ride bikes down tree-lined streets, and where nothing truly terrible is supposed to happen. But in January 2009, something terrible did happen. And like so many true crime stories, it unfolded behind closed doors, in a home that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. This is the story of Dale Harrell, a hard-working mechanical engineer with a bright future ahead of him. And it's the story of Marissa DeVault, his wife of nearly 10 years, whose web of lies would eventually unravel in one of Arizona's most talked-about murder trials. So as we settle in, let me tell you what happened on that cold January night. Dale Harrell was born on December 18, 1974. By all accounts, he was a gentle soul, the kind of person who worked hard, provided for his family, and looked forward to the future with optimism. By 2009, at 34 years old, Dale had built a respectable career as a mechanical engineer, earning around $83,000 a year. In a few months, he was set to become a partner at his company. Things were looking up. In September 1999, Dale married Marissa Suzanne DeVault. Marissa, who went by the nickname Reese, was born on November 6, 1977. She had worked as an exotic dancer before meeting Dale, and she came into the marriage with a daughter from a previous relationship, a little girl named Rhiannon. Dale welcomed Rhiannon into his life, though he never formally adopted her. Together, Dale and Marissa had two more children, sons named Tiernan and Danin. The family settled into a home in Gilbert, a sprawling suburb known for its excellent schools and family-friendly atmosphere. From the outside, they looked like any other American family trying to make it work. 2 parents, 3 kids, a mortgage, and dreams of a comfortable middle-class life. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. According to Marissa's later claims, Dale was a monster behind closed doors. She would allege that he physically beat her, sexually assaulted her, and subjected her to years of torment. She would paint a picture of a marriage filled with screaming matches, hidden bruises, and terror that existed just out of sight of their children. But friends of the couple told a different story. They described Dale as kind and gentle. They never witnessed abuse. They never saw the signs that Marissa would later describe. And as investigators would eventually discover, Marissa's version of events didn't quite add up, because while Dale was working long hours and planning for his promotion, Marissa was building a different kind of life, one that Dale knew nothing about. Sometime in 2007, about 8 years into her marriage, Marissa joined a website, but this wasn't your typical dating site. This was a platform designed to connect wealthy, older men, often called sugar daddies, with younger women who needed financial support. That's where she met Alan Flores. Flores was significantly older than Marissa, and he had money. Over the course of their relationship, which lasted approximately 2 years, Flores would loan Marissa an astonishing amount, more than $300,000. That's right, $300,000. At first, Flores believed Marissa's stories. She told him elaborate tales about coming into a large inheritance. Her stepfather, she said, had died and left her a fortune. All she needed was a little financial help to get through the probate process, and then she'd be able to pay him back with interest. She even signed promissory notes, official documents promising to repay him by December 31st. Flores, perhaps blinded by romance, or simply trusting by nature, kept writing checks. 30,000 here, 50,000 there. The money flowed from his accounts to hers in a steady stream. But there was a problem with Marissa's story. Her stepfather wasn't dead. He was very much alive. When police later questioned Flores, he admitted something chilling. By December 2008, he had started to get suspicious. Something about Marissa's stories didn't add up. So he did something unusual. He started documenting everything she said. He kept notes. He saved messages. He prepared himself. Just in case. And the things Marissa told him became increasingly disturbing. According to Flores' later testimony, Marissa had mentioned wanting to hire a hitman to kill Dale. She talked about insurance policies. She discussed plans, and in one particularly damning conversation, she allegedly told Flores that if she killed Dale herself, she'd claim he got drunk and tried to rape her. A story of self-defense that no one would question. Flores would later testify that Marissa hurriedly sent in a premium payment on Dale's life insurance and told him about her plan to have her husband killed. But Flores wasn't the only man in Marissa's secret life. The couple also had a roommate, a man named Stanley Cook Jr., who went by Uncle Stan around the house. Stanley had suffered a brain injury in a motorcycle accident back in 1998, which left him with significant short-term memory problems. He lived with the family, helping out where he could. And then there were other boyfriends, other lovers, other men who would later come forward with their own disturbing stories about what Marissa had asked them to do. One former boyfriend would testify that Marissa had asked him to take care of Dale. She'd even told this man that Dale had died of stomach cancer. Another lie, perhaps testing the waters, seeing how he'd react to the news of Dale's death before it actually happened. The picture that emerges is of a woman living a double life. On one side, the suburban mother, the engineer's wife, the woman who attended school events and made dinner. On the other, someone drowning in debts, spinning increasingly elaborate lies, and possibly planning something unthinkable. And the walls were closing in. The $300,000 she owed to Flores was coming due. The promissory notes were about to become a real problem. She needed money, and she needed it fast. On January 1st, 2009, just 13 days before everything would change, Marissa took out a life insurance policy on Dale. The policy was worth $500,000. Combined with another existing policy, Dale's death would bring Marissa $1,250,000. More than enough to pay back Flores. More than enough to start over. The clock was ticking. January 14th, 2009. A Wednesday night in Gilbert, Arizona. The temperature had dropped into the 40s, cold by Arizona standards. Most of the neighborhood was asleep, their homes dark and quiet under the vast desert sky. Inside the Harrell home, Dale went to bed as usual. He had work in the morning. He kissed his wife, maybe said goodnight to the kids, and climbed into the master bedroom he shared with Marissa. He got undressed, laid down on his side of the bed, and drifted off to sleep. He had no idea it would be the last time he'd ever close his eyes peacefully. Sometime in those dark hours, Marissa entered the bedroom. In her hand, she carried a claw hammer, the kind you'd use for pulling nails, with a curved back and a heavy metal head. And then, as Dale slept, she raised the hammer. The first blow struck Dale's head with devastating force. His skull cracked. He thrashed, moaning in pain, his body responding to the trauma even as his mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. But Marissa didn't stop. She struck him again, and again, and again. Some accounts say 5 times. Others suggest more. The exact number doesn't matter. What matters is that she kept hitting him, kept bringing that hammer down on her husband's head as he lay defenseless in their marriage bed. Blood sprayed across the pillow. It soaked into the sheets. Dale's skull fractured in multiple places. The injuries so severe that brain tissue was exposed. He collapsed onto the floor beside the bed, his body convulsing, his arms and legs thrashing involuntarily. Marissa left the bloody hammer on the bedside table. Then, at 2:45 in the morning, she called 911. When the Gilbert police arrived at the house, they found the front door wide open. A moment later, a woman emerged from the darkness, hysterical and covered in blood. This was Marissa DeVault. She had blood on her forehead and her hair, but when officers asked about her injuries, she insisted the blood wasn't hers. It was Dale's. Her story came out in fragments. Between sobs and gasps, she told the police that Dale had strangled her. He'd tried to sexually assault her. She'd lost consciousness. When she came to, there was someone else in the room. An intruder, she said. This unknown assailant was hitting Dale with a hammer. The officers rushed inside and found Dale in the master bedroom. He was naked, lying face down on the floor, thrashing and moaning. The right side of his head had been caved in. Blood pooled around him. A pillow on the bed was soaked crimson, and there on the bedside table sat a blood-stained claw hammer. Paramedics arrived and carefully transported Dale to the hospital. Doctors examined his shattered skull and delivered grim news. Dale had suffered multiple skull fractures. The damage was catastrophic. His brain had been severely traumatized. But Dale didn't die that night. He held on. Meanwhile, Marissa had been arrested at the hospital and charged with aggravated assault. Officers had noticed something interesting. Marissa had reddened marks on her neck, consistent with her claim that Dale had strangled her. But the scene didn't match her story about an intruder. She was taken to the local jail, but she didn't stay long. Someone posted her bail and she was released within hours. That someone was Alan Flores, the man she owed $300,000. As Dale lay in a hospital bed, fighting for his life, the police investigation intensified. They began interviewing friends and family. They talked to people who knew the couple, and a disturbing pattern emerged. No one had ever seen Dale abuse Marissa. No one had witnessed the violent rages she described. The friends characterized Dale as gentle, hard-working, kind. The police started digging into Marissa's background, and that's when the lies began to unravel. First, they discovered the truth about the inheritance. Marissa had told multiple people, including Flores, that her stepfather had died and left her money. But when police checked, they found that her stepfather was alive and well. There was no inheritance. There never had been. Then they found out about Flores. Marissa had initially introduced him to police as an ex-lover of her stepfather. Another lie in a growing web of deception. The true nature of their relationship and the massive debt quickly became apparent. Police searched Flores' home twice. During one of these searches, they made a disturbing discovery. Flores had child pornography on his computer. This revelation would later complicate the case in ways no one could have predicted. But the most shocking development came from an unexpected source. Stanley Cook Jr., the roommate with a brain injury, suddenly confessed. He walked into the Gilbert Police Department and told detectives that he was the one who had killed Dale Harrell. He said he'd done it because Dale had been abusive to Marissa. At first, this seemed to support Marissa's story. But there was a problem. The evidence didn't match Cook's confession. The blood spatter patterns, the angle of the blows, the forensic evidence, none of it suggested that Cook had been the attacker. And Cook, with his memory problems, couldn't provide details. He couldn't explain how it happened or why. His confession seemed almost scripted, as if someone had told him what to say. Police concluded that Cook was either covering for Marissa or had been manipulated into believing he'd done something he hadn't. They didn't charge him with the crime. Marissa's story had now shifted from an unknown intruder did it to Stanley did it. But investigators weren't buying it. And then on February 9th, 2009, 26 days after the attack, Dale Harrell died. The cause wasn't directly from the head injuries, though those had certainly put him on this path. Dale's weakened body had suffered a stroke, then 2 heart attacks. Finally, a blood clot formed in his lungs. His organs, damaged and failing, simply couldn't recover. Gilbert, Arizona, had its first homicide case since 2007. Marissa was arrested again, this time charged with first-degree murder. She was taken back to jail on February 20th, 2009. The aggravated assault charge had just become something much, much worse. But the bizarre twists in this case weren't over yet. On the very same day that Dale died, February 9th, something strange happened to Marissa. She claimed she went out for a morning jog, even though she was out on bail for aggravating assault. It was early, around 3 a.m. The streets were dark and empty. According to Marissa, she was attacked by an unknown assailant. This person, she said, beat her severely, leaving her with a broken jaw and a broken ankle. She was found lying in a field, injured and alone. Police investigated. And once again, they found themselves looking at Stanley Cook Jr. When officers went to Cook's home, they discovered bloody, muddy clothing. Cook eventually admitted to the assault, but his explanation was unusual. According to Cook, Marissa had asked him to hurt her. She wanted to be paralyzed, she said, so she could collect on a life insurance policy. Cook claimed he initially suggested shooting her in the spine to cause paralysis, but worried it would cause too much damage. Instead, he'd beaten her with a sledgehammer, focusing on her head and ankle. The implication was clear. Even after killing Dale, Marissa was still trying to defraud insurance companies. She was still scheming, still lying, still trying to find a way to get money. Stanley Cook confessed to assaulting Marissa, but he wouldn't face significant charges for it. His role in this bizarre saga would remain a strange footnote to a much larger story. With Dale dead, and the murder charge filed, Marissa needed a new strategy. She abandoned her stories about intruders and Stanley Cook. Instead, she finally admitted what investigators had suspected all along. Yes, she had attacked Dale with the hammer. Yes, she had struck him multiple times in the head while he slept. But it wasn't murder, she insisted. It was self-defense. Marissa submitted a 300-page confession to the Gilbert police. In it, she detailed years of alleged abuse. She claimed that Dale had beaten her regularly, that he'd raped her, that he'd sent her to the hospital multiple times. She said that on January 14th, the day of the attack, Dale had raped her yet again. And when he fell asleep afterward, something inside her snapped. She described living in terror. She talked about hiding bruises from friends and family. She mentioned a specific incident where Dale had allegedly shoved her so hard in front of witnesses that her shoulder dislocated, which someone had helped pop back into place. Marissa's defense team embraced this narrative. They would argue that she suffered from battered woman syndrome and PTSD. They had to explain why she'd attacked Dale while he slept when he posed no immediate threat, and they did this by claiming that years of trauma had left her unable to think rationally. She'd been triggered by the alleged rape, and in her traumatized state, she'd lashed out when she finally felt safe enough to do so. One of Marissa's daughters would testify that she'd witnessed Dale abuse her mother. This testimony was powerful and emotional. A child saying she saw her father hurt her mother. How could that not sway a jury? But the prosecution had a different story to tell. The prosecutors painted Marissa as a cold, calculating killer who'd murdered her husband for money. They presented the timeline, January 1st, 2009. Marissa takes out a $500,000 life insurance policy on Dale. Just 13 days later, Dale is beaten nearly to death in his sleep. The policies combined would pay out $1,250,000 more than enough to pay back the $300,000 she owed Flores and still have plenty left over. They brought in Alan Flores to testify despite the complications of his child pornography charges. In exchange for full immunity on those charges, Flores told the jury about Marissa's statements. She talked about hiring someone to kill Dale. She'd discussed how she'd claim self-defense if she did it herself. She'd asked about how life insurance payouts worked. Another of Marissa's former lovers testified that she'd asked him to take care of Dale. She had initially told this man that Dale had died of stomach cancer, perhaps gauging his reaction, seeing if he'd believe her lies. The prosecution brought in forensic experts who described the brutal nature of the attack, the blood spatter patterns, the angle of the blows, the force required to fracture a skull in multiple places. This wasn't a panicked act of self-defense. This was a sustained violent assault on a sleeping man, and they highlighted all of Marissa's lies. The intruder, Stanley Cook. The inheritance that never existed. The web of deception that stretched back years. Most damningly, the prosecution pointed out that while Marissa claimed years of abuse, not a single friend or acquaintance could corroborate her story. No one had seen Dale hurt her. No one had witnessed the violence she described. There were no hospital records of the injuries she claimed Dale had inflicted. No documentation whatsoever. They also brought in Dr. Jane DeMarte, a clinical psychologist who examined Marissa. Dr. DeMarte diagnosed Marissa with antisocial personality disorder, the clinical term for what many people call sociopathy. It's characterized by a lack of empathy, a pattern of lying and manipulation, and a disregard for the rights of others. Dr. DeMarte asked a pointed question. If Marissa's own mother and stepfather had abused her as a child, as the defense claimed, why had Marissa given them custody of her children? Why would she entrust her kids to her abusers? The prosecution even played jailhouse phone recordings where Marissa could be heard laughing about Dale's death. Not crying, not expressing remorse. Laughing. The trial began in January 2014, 5 years after Dale's death. The delay had been caused by various legal maneuverings and complications. Judge Roland Steinle presided. He made an unusual comment during jury selection. He didn't want anyone on the jury who was addicted to Jodi Arias. This wasn't a random reference. Just a year earlier, in the very same courthouse, Jodi Arias had been tried for the brutal murder of her boyfriend, Travis Alexander. That case had captivated the nation with its lurid details. Arias's changing stories and her claims of self-defense against an allegedly abusive partner. The parallels were striking. Both cases involved Arizona women who had killed their partners. Both defendants claimed abuse and self-defense. Both had been caught in multiple lies. And bizarrely, Marissa DeVault and Jodi Arias had actually been in contact with each other while awaiting trial. The trial lasted about 2 months, with testimony from dozens of witnesses. The defense called Dr. John Conte, a clinical psychologist who specialized in child abuse. Dr. Conte testified that Marissa's actions were consistent with someone who'd suffered childhood trauma. He painted a picture of a woman trapped in cycles of abuse, first as a child and then as an adult. But the prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They systematically dismantled each of Marissa's claims. They showed the jury the financial motive. They demonstrated the premeditation. They proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Marissa had lied repeatedly. Jury deliberations began. 5 days passed. Then 6. The wait was agonizing for everyone involved. Dale's family, Marissa's family, the prosecution, the defense. Finally, on April 8, 2014, the verdict came in. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. Marissa sat facing the jury, her expression blank as the verdict was read. In the gallery, Dale's friends and family wept, some with relief, some with grief, some with anger. But the trial wasn't over. Now came the penalty phase. In Arizona, when someone is convicted of first-degree murder, the jury must decide whether the crime was committed with excessive cruelty, an aggravating factor that makes the defendant eligible for the death penalty. The jury found that yes, excessive cruelty had been used. Striking a sleeping man in the head repeatedly with a hammer certainly qualified. This meant Marissa DeVault could face execution. If sentenced to death, she would become only the 3rd woman on Arizona's death row. The penalty phase of the trial began on April 15, 2014. Both sides presented their arguments again, this time focusing specifically on whether Marissa deserved to die for what she'd done. The prosecution reminded the jury of the brutality of the crime. Dale had been defenseless, asleep in his own bed, when his wife, the person who should have been his safe harbor, had attacked him. He'd suffered for weeks before finally succumbing to his injuries. His parents had lost their son. His children had lost their father. The defense argued for mercy. They emphasized Marissa's alleged history of childhood abuse. They suggested that executing her would serve no purpose, that life in prison without parole would be punishment enough. Marissa herself addressed the court. She apologized, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm sorry, not only for my actions, but for everyone I hurt," she said. She turned to Dale's parents, who sat in the courtroom, their faces etched with grief. "My heart goes out to them," Marissa continued. His mother and father have had to experience the worst loss in the world, the loss of a child. I know there is nothing I can say that will ever ease their pain. The jury deliberated for days. Death penalty decisions are never made lightly. On April 30th, 2014, they reached a decision. Life in prison, not death. Life. The jury had chosen to spare Marissa DeVault's life, but they ensured she would never walk free again. Maricopa County Attorney Bill Montgomery later explained the decision. Imposing the death penalty in any circumstance is difficult, and in this one, the jurors felt that a life sentence was appropriate. On June 6, 2014, Judge Steinle formally sentenced Marissa to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She would spend the rest of her days behind bars. Today, Marissa DeVault is incarcerated at the Arizona State Prison Complex, Perryville, in Goodyear, Arizona. She's now in her late 40s, serving a sentence that will end only with her death. In 2016, Marissa appealed her conviction. She argued that errors had been made during her trial, that her rights had been violated, that the conviction should be overturned. The appellate court disagreed. They affirmed both her conviction and her sentence. Marissa DeVault would remain in prison. Dale Harrell's family tried to move on with their lives. though the pain of losing him never truly faded. After Dale's death, Marissa had his body cremated, and then refused to give his ashes to his parents. Dale's family had to file a civil lawsuit just to get their son's remains returned to them. The cruelty of that act, the final indignity, seemed emblematic of everything Marissa had done. The three children, Briana, Karen, and Danian, were left to grow up without their father and with their mother in prison for his murder. The testimony of one daughter claiming she'd witnessed abuse would forever complicate the family dynamics. What's the truth? Did she really see what she said she saw? Or had she been influenced, coached, or manipulated? We may never know for certain. Alan Flores, the man who loaned Marissa over $300,000, presumably never got his money back. The insurance companies never paid out on Dale's policies, as Flores had predicted. They contested the claims given the suspicious timing and circumstances of Dale's death. Stanley Cook Jr., the roommate with the brain injury who'd initially confessed to the murder, and later admitted to assaulting Marissa at her request, faded into obscurity. His bizarre role in this story, false confessor, weapon in an insurance fraud scheme, was never fully explained or understood. The case drew comparisons to Jodi Arias' trial, and for good reason. Both cases featured attractive defendants who'd killed their partners. Both involved claims of abuse that many people doubted. Both women had changed their stories multiple times, and both trials had captivated the public's attention with their dramatic testimony and disturbing details. But there's one crucial difference. The evidence against Marissa was in many ways more clear-cut. The financial motive was obvious. The timeline was damning. The lies were numerous and documented, while Jodi Arias maintained her innocence through much of her trial. Marissa eventually admitted to the killing. She just claimed it was justified. The jury didn't believe her. As with many true crime cases, the conviction and sentencing don't answer every question. Was Dale Harrell the gentle, hard-working man his friends described? Or was he a monster behind closed doors who abused his wife and children for years? Marissa's daughter testified that she'd seen the abuse, but friends saw nothing. Medical records showed nothing. The evidence suggested Marissa was lying, but what if in this one thing she was telling the truth? If Dale was abusive, does that excuse what Marissa did? Many people who've suffered abuse don't kill their abusers. Many find other ways to escape. And if Marissa was truly in danger, why didn't she take the insurance money she'd received in the past? She did have access to finances through her relationship with Flores and simply leave. The timing of the insurance policy is hard to ignore. 13 days before the murder, Marissa takes out a $500,000 policy on Dale's life. That's not the action of someone in fear for her life. That's the action of someone planning something. And yet the mind is complex. People are capable of holding contradictory truths. It's possible that Dale was difficult, even occasionally frightening, without being the monster Marissa described. It's possible that Marissa exaggerated or fabricated much of the abuse while still feeling genuinely trapped. It's possible that greed and fear and desperation all mixed together in her mind, until she convinced herself that murder was the only way out. What we know for certain is this. On January 14th, 2009, Dale Harrell went to sleep in his own bed, and he never woke up. He died nearly a month later from complications of the brutal beating his wife had inflicted on him. 3 children lost their father, 2 parents lost their son, and Marissa DeVault lost her freedom forever. The murder of Dale Harrell reminds us that the truth is often more complicated than we want it to be. We want clear villains and innocent victims. We want simple explanations for terrible things. But real life is messy. People lie, but their lies sometimes contain kernels of truth. People commit terrible acts, but they're rarely purely evil. And sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one sleeping beside you every night. Dale Harrell will never get to see his children grow up. He'll never get that partnership he was working toward. He'll never grow old, never retire, never get to enjoy the life he'd been building. And Marissa DeVault will spend the rest of her life behind bars. Her freedom gone, her children scattered, her lies finally exposed. In the end, there were no winners in this story. Only loss, grief, and the haunting question of what might have been if different choices had been made on that January night in Gilbert, Arizona. Rest in peace, Dale Harrell. December 18, 1974 to February 9, 2009. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're traveling back to January 2008, to the high desert city of Reno, Nevada, where the bright lights of casinos meet the shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains. This is a story about a young woman whose life was stolen in the darkness, and about how a community refused to let her memory fade. This is the story of Briana Dennison. Briana Zanino Dennison was born on March 29, 1988, in Reno, Nevada. Her mother, Bridget, gave her a special nickname from the very beginning, Breezy. She said her daughter reminded her of a breath of fresh air on a cool summer day, and anyone who knew Briana understood why. With her million-dollar smile and sparkling blue eyes, Briana had the kind of presence that lit up a room. She was outgoing and compassionate, the type of person who never forgot a birthday or anniversary. Even when she went away to college, she made sure to stay in touch with everyone she cared about. Briana's childhood was touched by tragedy early on. When she was just 6 years old, her father, Jeff, passed away. The loss was devastating for young Briana and her mother. The family moved to Bridget's hometown of Mendocino, California, seeking solace and support from extended family. It was there, surrounded by the rugged beauty of the Northern California coast, that Briana began to heal. The experience of losing her father shaped Briana in profound ways. She participated in art therapy to process her grief, and the experience planted a seed. She discovered she wanted to help other children who were dealing with loss and trauma. By the time she was a teenager, Briana knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life: become a child psychologist. Briana was a curious soul with an insatiable appetite for the world. She traveled extensively with her family, visiting Hawaii, New York, Mexico, Jamaica, Japan, Italy, Egypt, Hungary, Austria, and France. She even spent a year studying abroad in Rome. These experiences shaped her worldview and gave her an extraordinary ability to connect with people from walks of life. In 2006, Briana graduated from Reno High School. She chose to attend Santa Barbara City College, where she pursued her dream of studying psychology. She loved the beach, the sun, the warmth. Her Aunt Lauren would later say that Briana hated being cold, and probably would never have moved back to Reno after college. The ocean called to her in a way the high desert never could. But in January 2008, Briana came home for winter break. She had plans to attend the SWAT 72 Snowboarding Festival, a multi-day event that brought students from across the region to Reno for Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. It was an event she'd attended before, and she was looking forward to seeing old friends. Briana was security conscious, always careful about where she went and who she was with. Before she left her mother's house that Saturday night, January 19th, she did something that showed just how responsible she was. She made a list of all the events she planned to attend, gave it to her mother, and told her exactly where she'd be ending the night: at the home of her friend KT Hunter, who lived near the University of Nevada, Reno campus. Saturday night unfolded exactly as planned. Briana, KT, and another housemate went to the SWAT events, laughing and catching up on life. The night stretched into early morning, as nights with old friends often do. Around 3 in the morning, they found themselves at Mel's Diner inside the Sands Regency Casino Hotel, sharing an early breakfast. The diner was warm and bright, filled with the comfortable hum of late-night conversation and the clatter of dishes. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, January 20th, 4 male companions dropped Briana and KT off at the burnt orange 2-story rental house on Mackay Court. The young men watched the 2 women enter the house safely before driving away into the darkness. Inside, the house was quiet. The other residents were already asleep. KT headed upstairs to her bedroom, taking her dog with her and locking the bedroom door behind her. This was her routine, nothing unusual. Briana, meanwhile, settled onto the couch in the living room. At 5 feet tall and 98 pounds, she curled up easily on the cushions, pulling a pillow under her head. Here's what made this decision so ordinary, so unremarkable. The front door, with its glass panels, was left unlocked. This wasn't carelessness. It was simply how the household operated. The girls who lived there routinely left their doors unlocked for each other and their friends. In that neighborhood, near the college campus, it felt safe. Briana presumably drifted off to sleep, exhausted from a long night of festivities. The house was silent. Outside, Reno slept under a dark winter sky. When Katie woke up about 5 hours later, around 9 in the morning, she began looking for her friend. But Briana wasn't on the couch. She wasn't anywhere in the house. What Katie found instead sent a chill through her entire body. A silver dollar-sized bloodstain on the pillow where Briana had been sleeping. All of Briana's belongings were still there. Her cell phone, her purse, her clothes, her shoes. Everything that she would need to leave the house voluntarily was still sitting exactly where she'd left it. Briana had vanished into thin air, wearing only sweatpants and a white tank top. Katie called Briana's mother immediately. Briana Dennison knew. In that instant, in that sick dropping feeling in her stomach, that something was very, very wrong. Her daughter would never disappear without contacting her. Bridget got in her car and drove to the house as KT called 911. What began as a missing person case quickly evolved into something far more sinister. When Reno police arrived at the McKay Court residence, they conducted a thorough forensic investigation. The blood on the pillow was confirmed to be Briana's. Even more troubling, investigators found touch DNA belonging to an unidentified male on the doorknob. Someone had walked into that house in the early morning hours. Someone had taken Briana Dennison. As detectives began to investigate Briana's disappearance, a disturbing pattern emerged. The area around the University of Nevada, Reno campus, where Briana had been staying, had been terrorized by a series of sexual assaults in the months leading up to her abduction. The first attack occurred in October 2007. A woman reported being raped at gunpoint in a parking garage on the UNR campus, though she hadn't immediately come forward to police. On November 13, 2007, there was an attempted sexual assault in the same area. A young woman managed to fight off her attacker, but the incident left the community shaken. Then on December 16, 2007, just over a month before Briana's disappearance, a 22-year-old foreign exchange student was attacked in a parking lot near UNR. She remembered her attacker putting his hand over her mouth. And nothing. She lost consciousness. When she came to, she was in a vehicle. Her attacker was sexually assaulting her. Throughout the ordeal, he kept telling her not to look at his face. But even in her terror, the young woman gathered crucial details. Her attacker was a white male. He spoke English without any accent, and she noticed something specific about his hands. He had thick, meaty fingers. After the assault, he drove her to another location and dropped her off. Before he let her go, he took something, her underwear. It was a trophy. Investigators would later realize, a souvenir. The woman was able to tell police one more important detail. Her attacker had been driving a 2005 to 2006 Toyota Tacoma extended cab pickup truck. When investigators tested the DNA from the crime scene where Briana had been abducted, they made a chilling connection. The DNA matched the DNA from the December sexual assault. The same person who had attacked the foreign exchange students had taken Briana Dennison. A serial rapist was hunting in the streets around the University of Nevada, Reno campus, and his violence was escalating. As word of Briana's disappearance spread, something remarkable happened. The entire city of Reno came together. The FBI joined the investigation almost immediately. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children got involved. Volunteers from national missing children's organizations, the Laura Recovery Center, and the Polly Klaas Foundation traveled to Reno to help with the search. Approximately 1,700 volunteers fanned out across a 100-square-mile area, searching for any trace of Briana. Among those volunteers was Nevada's First Lady, Dawn Gibbons, wife of then-Governor Jim Gibbons. The search was exhaustive, desperate, and heartbreaking. A website was launched, BrianaDennison.com. Billboards went up across the city, showing Briana's beautiful face and asking for any information. A vigil was held at Reno High School, where Briana had graduated just 2 years earlier. Hundreds of people attended, holding candles and praying for her safe return. The Reno Police Department worked around the clock. Lieutenant Robert McDonald, head of the Robbery Homicide Unit, and Detective Dave Jenkins, a 32-year veteran, led the investigation. They interviewed nearly 100 registered sex offenders who lived within a mile of the McKay Court home. Tips poured in. Over 2,000 tips, each one carefully investigated. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted. The national media descended on Reno. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, ABC, CBS. They all covered the story of the college student who had vanished from a couch. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a different kind of mobilization was taking place. Washoe County asked the private sector for donations to help process a massive backlog of DNA samples. Within days, donations exceeded the goal of $150,000. The community was determined to bring Briana home. But as the days stretched into weeks, hope began to fade. On Friday, February 15th, 2008, Albert Jimenez was on his lunch break. He worked at EE Technologies, a company in a South Reno industrial area. Rather than walking along the sidewalk, Jimenez decided to take a shortcut across a vacant field near his workplace. As he walked, something caught his eye. Among a pile of discarded tree limbs and debris in a shallow ditch, there was a flash of bright orange, neon orange socks, standing out against the brown and gray of the winter landscape. Jimenez moved closer. The socks were attached to feet. At first, his mind couldn't process what he was seeing. He thought it might be a mannequin, perhaps something discarded from a store. But as he got closer, the terrible truth became undeniable. It was a woman, and she was deceased. Jimenez didn't have a cell phone, so he ran back to his workplace and called the Reno police. When police arrived at the scene, they found Briana Dennison's body in that ditch, partially covered by a discarded Christmas tree. She was wearing only those bright orange socks. She had been there for more than a week through rain and snow. The autopsy confirmed what everyone had feared. Briana had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The cause of death was ligature strangulation. Someone had strangled her with a pair of underwear. But here's where the investigation took a crucial turn. Near Briana's body, investigators found two pairs of underwear that didn't belong to her. One was pink. The other was black with Pink Panther emblems on them. Forensic testing would reveal that the pink pair contained DNA from Briana, from her friend KT Hunter, and from Briana's attacker. The black pair with the Pink Panther emblems told an even more disturbing story. They belonged to the foreign exchange student who had been attacked in December. Her attacker had kept him as a trophy after raping her. And now he had left them with Briana's body. It was a calling card. A taunt. The killer was telling investigators, "I did this. And I did that too." The discovery of Briana's body transformed the investigation. What had been a desperate search for a missing girl was now a murder investigation, and police knew they were hunting a serial rapist and killer. Detective Adam Wagnansky and his team worked tirelessly, following every lead, no matter how small. They knew several crucial facts about their suspect. He was local to the Reno area. He drove a Toyota Tacoma pickup truck. He had thick fingers. And he had an unusual fetish, collecting underwear from one victim and leaving it at the next crime scene. Police released a composite sketch based on the foreign exchange student's description. They released information about the truck. They urged anyone with information to come forward. The investigation continued through the spring and into the summer. Months passed. Briana's family held a celebration of life at the Reno Sparks Convention Center on February 23rd, attended by hundreds of people. Thousands more left teddy bears, flowers, and blue ribbons at a makeshift memorial at the site where Briana's body had been found. Brigitte Zanino Dennison established the Bringbury Justice Foundation, determined that her daughter's death would lead to change. But as 2008 wore on, there was still no arrest. Then, on November 1st, 2008, the secret witness hotline received a call that would break the case wide open. The caller was a woman. She was calling about her friend's boyfriend. Her friend had confided something troubling to her. While traveling back from Washington State, the friend had found women's underwear in her boyfriend's truck. Underwear that didn't belong to her. When the friend confronted her boyfriend about the underwear, his reaction had been strange. Evasive. The caller told secret witness that this boyfriend's activities and behavior made him seem like a likely suspect in the Briana Dennison case. The boyfriend's name was James Michael Bila. He was 27 years old, a pipe fitter from Sparks, Nevada. He was a former Marine, and when investigators began looking into his background, pieces started to fall into place. Bila owned a Toyota Tacoma pickup truck, matching the description from the December assault. He worked as a pipe fitter, a job that would give him those distinctive, thick, meaty fingers the victim had described. He had a previous arrest from 2001 for threatening his ex-girlfriend's neighbor with a knife. The detectives began surveillance on Bila. On November 6, 2008, Detective Wygrananski called Bila to set up a meeting. Interestingly, Bila never asked what the detective was investigating. The next day, Wygrananski met with Bila in person. He explained that he was investigating the Briana Dennison murder. According to Wygrananski's later testimony, Bila's entire demeanor changed in that moment. The jovial, friendly manner disappeared. He went silent, looked straight out the window, and tried to avoid eye contact. He started to sweat. Wygrananski asked Bila if he would provide a voluntary DNA sample to clear himself from the investigation. Bila refused. He said his girlfriend would be able to give him an alibi for the morning. Briana disappeared, but Bila's girlfriend didn't provide an alibi. Instead, she did something extraordinary. She gave police permission to collect DNA from the couple's 4-year-old son. The DNA test on Bila's son revealed something crucial. The child's biological father could not be ruled out as the source of the DNA evidence gathered from both the Briana Dennison crime scene and the December sexual assault scene. In other words, James Bila was almost certainly Briana's killer. Armed with this evidence, Reno police obtained an arrest warrant. On Tuesday, November 25, 2008, nearly 10 months after Briana's murder, they made their move. James Bila was arrested as he arrived at the Stepping Stones Children's Center in Reno to pick up his son from daycare. Officers took him into custody and immediately obtained a warrant for his DNA. The Washoe County Crime Lab worked through the night, processing Bila's DNA sample. On Wednesday, November 26, 2008, the Reno Police Department held a press conference. Chief Michael Pullman stood before a large photo of Briana Dennison and announced that the DNA collected from James Bila was a direct match to the DNA found at the crime scene. They had their killer. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Reno community. After months of fear, months of wondering who among them was capable of such brutality, the nightmare was over. Briana's aunt, Lauren Dennison, spoke to the media with tears in her eyes. "We are pleased that this person is off the street and he cannot hurt anyone else," she said. Sheriff Mike Haley stood beside a photo of Briana at the press conference. "No one should have to suffer as Briana Dennison did," he said. His voice carried the weight of those 10 months, the exhaustive investigation, the sleepless nights. Lieutenant Robert McDonald spoke about the profile they had developed. "We knew we were looking for someone unobtrusive, who stalked his victims quietly but escalated his violence with each new attack," he said. The profile fit Bila perfectly. As investigators dug deeper into James Bila's life, a disturbing timeline emerged. His violence hadn't begun with Briana. It had been building for months. In October 2007, the first reported attack occurred in a campus parking garage. The victim had been too traumatized to immediately report the crime, but when she finally came forward, her description matched Bila. In November, there was the attempted assault. The victim fought back, escaped, but Bila wasn't deterred. In December, he attacked a foreign exchange student. This time, he was more sophisticated. He used a vehicle. He took trophies. He warned his victim not to look at his face. Then came January 20th, 2008. Briana Dennison. This time, he didn't just assault his victim, he killed her. What investigators found particularly chilling was what happened after Briana's body was discovered on February 15th. That very same day, Bila went to his supervisor, Jeremy Costin, and asked for a voluntary layoff. Costin had talked Bila out of quitting earlier that month. But this time, Bila insisted. He left his job the day Briana's body was found. In March, shortly after police released the composite sketch and the description of the truck, Bila left Nevada altogether. He took a job in Washington state and he sold his Toyota Tacoma pickup truck, the vehicle that matched witness descriptions. The vehicle that had become too dangerous to keep. Bila's co-workers would later testify about changes in his behavior. John Latham, his foreman, said Bila had been a good worker, but his attitude changed dramatically in the fall of 2007. He seemed frustrated, angry. He even punched a wall at one point. Perhaps most disturbing was Biela's reaction when Briana's body was found. According to testimony, Latham had asked Biela how he felt about the discovery. Biela's response was chilling. The bitch probably had it coming. Latham didn't report this comment to police at the time. He would later say he thought it was just Biela's sense of humor, that a lot of guys talk that way. But in retrospect, in the context of everything they would learn, those words took on a much darker meaning. James Michael Bila's trial began in May 2010, over 2 years after Briana's murder. It was a media sensation, drawing coverage from national news outlets and gripping the Reno community once again. The prosecution's case was built on several pillars of evidence. First and foremost was the DNA. The match was indisputable. Biela's DNA was found on the doorknob at the house where Briana was abducted. It was found on the underwear near her body. It matched the DNA from the December assault. The testimony from the other victims was devastating. The foreign exchange student took the stand and recounted her attack in December. She described how her attacker threatened her with a gun, how he raped her, how he took her underwear as a souvenir. The defense challenged her identification, pointing out that she had initially told a friend she couldn't describe her attacker, but the DNA evidence was irrefutable. Another victim, identified in court records only as Amanda C., also testified. She had been attacked in a campus parking garage. When Biela was named as a suspect in the Dennison case, she came forward and identified him as her attacker. "He's the man who haunts my dreams," she said on the stand. The most emotionally powerful testimony came from Carleen Harmon, Biela's ex-girlfriend and the mother of his son. Harmon testified that she had followed the Briana Dennison case closely from the very beginning. In fact, she could see the field where Briana's body was found from her office window. She had watched as police cordoned off the area. "I read everything that came out about it," Harmon said. "It was scary. But what made her testimony so damning was what she said about Biela's reaction to the case. According to Harmon, Bila seemed completely indifferent to Briana's murder. He told her that the only reason anyone cared about the case was because Briana was hot and came from a wealthy family. Harmon also testified about changes in Biela's behavior. Starting in October 2007, they began having daily arguments. Biela would leave their home for days at a time. He was really short-fused and angry and had no patience for anybody, she said. December is when it really was bad. And then there was the underwear. The friend who had called the secret witness line had been right. Harmon had found women's underwear in Biela's truck that didn't belong to her. When she confronted him about it, his reaction had been suspicious enough that she confided her concerns to her friend. The defense tried to argue that Biela had suffered an abusive childhood, that he'd had an alcoholic father, that he'd been a productive member of society before these crimes, that he was a model prisoner. They challenged the DNA testing methods. They questioned witness identifications, but the jury didn't buy it. On Thursday, May 27, 2010, after deliberating for about 9 hours, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on count 1, sexual assault against Amanda C. in October 2007. Guilty on count 2, kidnapping of the December victim. Guilty on count 3, sexual assault against the December victim. Guilty on count 4, murder of Briana Dennison. The jury determined it was first-degree murder. Guilty on count 5, sexual assault against Briana Dennison. The courtroom erupted. Briana's family wept. After 2 years of waiting, of reliving the nightmare through the trial, they finally had justice. But the proceedings weren't over. The jury still had to decide on the penalty. In Nevada, first-degree murder with special circumstances can carry the death penalty, and the prosecution was seeking it. The penalty phase was emotional. Briana's mother, Bridget, took the stand. She told the jury to show no mercy for the man who had killed her daughter and sexually assaulted 2 other young women. On June 2nd, 2010, after spending 3 hours in deliberations the previous evening and resuming Wednesday morning, the jury returned with their decision: slay death. James Michael Bila was sentenced to death for the murder of Briana Dennison. On July 30th, 2010, Judge Robert Perry added 4 consecutive life sentences for the rapes and kidnapping of the other 2 victims. In court, Bila apologized. He expressed regret that he wouldn't see his son grow up, but his words rang hollow. The enormity of his crimes far outweighed any remorse he claimed to feel. Bila filed numerous appeals over the years, claiming ineffective counsel, arguing that pretrial publicity necessitated a change of venue, challenging the DNA evidence. In 2012, the Nevada Supreme Court affirmed his conviction. They rejected his appeals again in 2016 and again in 2019. As of this recording, James Bila remains on death row at Ely State Prison in Nevada, though Nevada has not carried out an execution since 2006. But this story doesn't end with a conviction and a sentence. Briana's murder became a catalyst for change not just in Nevada, but across the nation. Briana Dennison channeled her grief into action. Through the Bring Bride Justice Foundation, she pushed for legislation that would help prevent future tragedies like her daughter's. The irony that haunted everyone involved in the case was this. James Bila had been arrested in 2001 for threatening his ex-girlfriend's neighbor with a knife. It was a felony arrest, but at that time, Nevada law only required DNA collection upon conviction, not upon arrest. If DNA had been taken from Bila in 2001, it would have been entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. When he committed his first reported rape in December 2007, police could have matched his DNA and identified him immediately. The attacks would have stopped there. Briana would still be alive. This realization drove Briana to testify before the Nevada legislature. She stood before lawmakers and shared her story, her loss, her grief. She advocated for a bill that would require DNA collection from anyone arrested for a felony, not just those convicted. The first attempt to pass such a bill failed in 2011, but Briana didn't give up. She came back in 2013, this time with even more support. She worked with lawmakers, addressed concerns, refined the legislation. The family turned over every rock, as Lauren Dennison put it, to make sure the bill would be effective and constitutional. On April 24, 2013, the Nevada Senate unanimously approved Senate Bill 24-3. It then went to the Assembly, where it passed on May 20th with a vote of 29-9, exactly the two-thirds majority needed. On May 29, 2013, Republican Governor Brian Sandoval signed the bill into law. Briana Dennison and Lauren Dennison stood beside him, along with dozens of family members and friends. It was, as Sandoval said, a historical day for Nevada. The law, officially known as Senate Bill 2043 but universally called Briana's Law, mandates that anyone arrested for a felony in Nevada must provide a DNA sample via cheek swab upon booking. If the arrest is deemed legitimate, the DNA is cross-referenced with DNA from other unsolved crimes. The law includes important protections. If probable cause is not established, the DNA is destroyed before any cross-referencing occurs. If someone is arrested but ultimately not charged, their DNA sample is destroyed. If someone is not convicted of a felony, they can petition to have their DNA sample destroyed and removed from the database. After 3 years with no matches, individuals can request removal of their DNA from the system. The impact of Briana's Law has been profound. By January 2018, just 5 years after the law went into effect, it had resulted in over 1,000 DNA matches to crimes. Unsolved rapes, murders, assaults, cases that had gone cold for years were suddenly being solved because of DNA collected at the time of arrest. 28 other states have similar laws, as does the federal government. But Nevada's law bears Briana's name, a lasting memorial to a young woman whose life was cut tragically short. Detective Dave Jenkins, who worked tirelessly on Briana's case, reflected on the law's significance. The real irony is if the law had evolved with technology 10 years ago, it's entirely possible that Mr. Bila would have been in custody for the original kidnapping and assault, and would not have been in a position where he could have taken Briana. Briana has said that lending Briana's name to this law, creating this legacy, was the best thing she could do for future victims. We knew for future victims that it was the best thing we could do, and lend Briana's name too. And that would be her legacy. Briana Dennison loved children. She was studying to become a child psychologist, inspired by her own experience with art therapy after her father's death. She wanted to help children process trauma, to heal, to grow. She loved to travel. She had seen so much of the world in her 19 years. Italy and Egypt, France and Hungary, Mexico and Jamaica. She connected with people everywhere she went, making friends easily with her radiant personality. She loved her family fiercely. Her mother called her breezy, a breath of fresh air. Her little brother, Brighton, looked up to her. She was close to her grandparents, her aunts, her uncles, her 13 cousins. She never forgot a birthday or an anniversary. She always stayed in touch. She loved the beach, the sun, the warmth of California. She hated being cold. Her Aunt Lauren believed Briana would have stayed in Southern California after college, building a life near the ocean she loved so much. But on a cold January night in 2008, all of those dreams, all of that potential, all of that bright, beautiful light was extinguished by a predator who had been allowed to hunt freely for far too long. The city of Reno came together in a way they never had before. 1,700 volunteers searched for Briana. Donations poured in to process DNA evidence. Thousands attended her celebration of life. The entire community mourned, and when justice was finally served, when James Bila was convicted and sentenced to death, the community celebrated. But they also committed to remembering. Hundreds of teddy bears and blue ribbons still mark the spot where Briana's body was found. Her name appears on billboards and in legislation. Her story is told and retold, a reminder of both tragedy and hope. Because of Briana, countless crimes have been solved. Because of Briana, countless future victims have been spared. Because of Briana, predators are caught before they can escalate their violence. Briana Dennison was 19 years old when she died. She had so much life ahead of her, so many children she could have helped, so many lives she could have touched. But even in death, she continues to make a difference. Rest peacefully, Breezy. Your legacy lives on. Please, if you're still awake, drop a candle. I want to see who's still with me. Also, don't forget to tell me where you're listening from, the time in your corner of the world, and maybe share one thing you've learned from tonight's stories. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, I want to tell you about a tragedy that unfolded in the city of Hull, England, on what should have been the most romantic day of the year. This is the story of Joanne Nelson, a young woman whose life was stolen from her by the person who claimed to love her most. It's a story about deception, violence hidden behind a charming facade, and a detective who saw what everyone else missed. So as we settle in, let me take you back to February 2005, to a small house on Holtham Road North in Hull, where beneath the surface of an ordinary relationship, something dark was waiting to emerge. Joanne Jean Nelson was 22 years old in the winter of 2005. She was the kind of person people remembered, not because she was loud or demanding attention, but because of the warmth she carried with her. Her family described her as vivacious, always smiling, the kind of daughter and sister who lit up a room simply by being in it. She worked at the local job center in Hull, but her ambitions stretched far beyond the city limits. Joanne had dreams of traveling the world. She'd been accepted as a volunteer in Ghana, though she hadn't taken up the opportunity yet. The world felt big to Joanne, full of possibilities, and she wanted to experience it all. She talked often about exotic destinations, about making a difference, about seeing things beyond the gray Yorkshire skies she'd known all her life. Joanne was close to her family, her father Charlie, her mother Jean, and her younger sister Katie. They were a tight-knit unit, the kind of family that spent weekends together, that checked in on each other, that noticed when something was wrong. And for the past 2 years, Joanne had been in a relationship with a man named Paul Dyson. To her family, to her friends, it seemed like she'd found someone special. They'd seen photographs of the couple smiling together. Joanne had spoken about wedding plans, about honeymooning in Mexico. She'd seemed happy, or at least that's what everyone thought they saw. Paul Dyson was 31 years old, 9 years older than Joanne. He worked as a nightclub bouncer, a big man who carried himself with the confidence that came from years of martial arts training and bodybuilding. He could be charming when he wanted to be. Attentive, the kind of man who knew how to make a woman feel special. But Paul Dyson carried secrets, dark secrets that Joanne knew nothing about. To understand what happened to Joanne Nelson, you have to understand the man Paul Dyson was. And perhaps more importantly, the man his father had been. Peter Dyson, Paul's father, was a killer. In 1966, when Paul was just a toddler, his father had stabbed a man named John Dickinson to death with a kitchen knife. The victim had been having an affair with Peter's wife, Paul's mother. In a rage, Peter Dyson had attacked the man and killed him. He served 6 years in prison for manslaughter. But that wasn't the only blood on Peter Dyson's hands. Shortly after the stabbing, while visiting his 2-day-old son Paul in the hospital, Peter Dyson was involved in a fatal hit-and-run accident. Violence seemed to follow him, or perhaps he followed it. Paul Dyson didn't just know about his father's violent past. He idolized it. To him, his father wasn't a cautionary tale, but something closer to a hero. A man who had acted with strength and decisiveness. This twisted admiration would shape the man Paul became, and Paul Dyson had already begun following in his father's footsteps. Before Joanne, there had been another woman. Paul had been married once, to a woman named Jenny Clark. Their relationship had been marked by violence from the very beginning. On their wedding night, Paul had assaulted Jenny. It wasn't the last time. During their 1.5 years together, he was violent on multiple occasions. Once he throttled her until she lost consciousness, his hands around her throat, squeezing until the world went dark for her. Jenny eventually left him, taking their 5-year-old daughter with her. She would later tell police that she'd seen something troubling in Paul, something troubled and dangerous that she couldn't fix and couldn't live with. But Joanne didn't know any of this. Paul had hidden his past well, presented himself as a devoted partner, someone building a life with her. The house they shared on Hotham Road North was Joanne's property, bought with her own money. They'd been together for 2 years, and to the outside world, they seemed like any other engaged couple planning their future. The truth, though, was something else entirely. February 14th, 2005. Valentine's Day. A day meant for love, for romance, for expressing devotion to the people we hold dear. With Joanne Nelson, it would be the last day of her life. The argument started over something mundane, something so ordinary it seems almost absurd. Laundry. Paul Dyson claimed later that Joanne had asked him to put a load of washing in the machine. He said he didn't know how to operate it, that this simple request had somehow escalated into something more. But the argument wasn't really about laundry. Arguments like this never are. They're about power, about control, about something deeper and darker that's been building beneath the surface. In the early hours of that morning, in the house on Hotham Road North, Paul Dyson's temper erupted. Maybe he felt threatened. Maybe he sensed that Joanne was losing interest in him, that she was beginning to see through the facade he'd worked so hard to maintain. Maybe he simply couldn't bear the thought of losing control. With his bare hands, Paul Dyson attacked Joanne. He wrapped his fingers around her throat and squeezed. Joanne would have struggled, anyone would. She would have tried to pull his hands away, her fingernails clawing at his skin, her body fighting desperately for air. The marks she left on his thumbs, crescent-shaped impressions from her nails, would later become crucial evidence. But Paul Dyson was strong. Years of martial arts training and bodybuilding had made sure of that. He was a bouncer, accustomed to using his physical presence to intimidate and control. Joanne, slightly built and caught off guard, had no chance against him. He strangled her to death. In her own home, on Valentine's Day. The woman he claimed to love. And when it was over, when Joanne lay dead, Paul Dyson didn't panic. He didn't call for help. He didn't try to resuscitate her. He didn't dial 999. Instead, he did something far more chilling. He began to plan. What Paul Dyson did next reveals the calculated nature of his actions. This wasn't a moment of passion followed by remorse. This was cold, methodical planning. First, he left the house. He drove from their home and hauled to the nearby town of Howden, where he stopped at a petrol station to fill up his car. This wasn't just about fuel. He was preparing for a journey. Then he returned home and went to the shop across the street from their house. CCTV cameras captured him there, walking in calmly, showing no signs of distress. He purchased bin liners, rubber gloves, and disinfectant spray. The footage shows a man who appears composed, ordinary, just another customer running errands. Back at the house, Paul set to work. He wrapped Joanne's body in the bin liners he'd just bought. He tied her up, treating her remains with what the judge would later call hideous indignities. Then he carried her body to his car and placed her in the boot. And then Paul Dyson drove. He drove north from Hull, past Howden, past York, all the way to a small village called Bransby in North Yorkshire. It was about 50 miles from their home, about 100 kilometers from where he'd killed her. He found a wooded area near Bransby Lodge, off the B-1363. The woods were quiet, secluded. Paul carried Joanne's body into the trees, about 150 meters from the road. There, in a shallow grave, he laid her down and covered her body with branches from pine trees, attempting to conceal what he'd done. Then he drove back to Hull, and he began the performance of his life. It was shortly before 9 o'clock on the evening of February 14th, when Paul Dyson called the police. "Hello there. My fiancée, I don't know where she is," he said, his voice carefully modulated to sound worried. "I just want to report somebody missing." The operator asked the standard questions. Had there been any arguments? Was Joanne depressed? "No, there's nothing like that. No, it's just completely out of character for her," Dyson replied. He told them a story he'd carefully constructed. That morning, he said, because he couldn't get Valentine's Day off work, he and Joanne had exchanged Valentine's cards upstairs in their bedroom. He'd given her a kiss and a cuddle, got ready for work. Joanne was going to get her head down for another hour, sleep in a bit. He'd kissed her goodbye and gone to work. That was it, he said, until he got home from work, and she wasn't there. It was a plausible story. Nothing too dramatic, nothing that raised immediate suspicion. Just a concerned partner reporting his fiancée missing. When the call ended, Paul Dyson joined Joanne's family in searching for her. He went door to door with them, knocking on neighbors' houses, his face a mask of worry. At one neighbor's house around 8 o'clock the next morning, a witness would later recall Paul standing at their doorstep in tears, alongside Joanne's father Charlie, asking if they'd seen Joanne. At the house on Holden Road North, police found everything seemingly in order. The Valentine's Day cards that Paul and Joanne had exchanged were displayed above the fireplace. A touching tableau of a couple in love. The only things out of place were Joanne herself, along with her purse, her phone, her work clothes, and a ring Paul claimed he'd surprised her with for Valentine's Day. Her car, a white Renault Clio, was parked up the road with its doors unlocked. It had last been seen in Howden at 2:30 in the afternoon on February 13th. The day before Valentine's Day, Paul's story seemed to check out. Detective Superintendent Ray Higgins was assigned to lead the case. He was an experienced investigator, someone who'd seen his share of missing persons cases. Some turned out fine, people who'd simply needed to get away, who showed up after a few days. Others didn't end well. As the days passed, the search for Joanne intensified. Hundreds of volunteers joined in. Police officers combed through the city. The army was brought in to help. Specialist search teams scoured Branningham on the outskirts of Hull. Volunteer teams searched the Hessel foreshore area. The International Rescue Corps, an independent United Nations registered rescue service, brought in their expertise. Leaflets with Joanne's photograph were handed out before Hull City's home game against Wrexham at the Kingston Communications Stadium. The whole city seemed to be looking for her. And through it all, Paul Dyson played his part perfectly. The worried fiancé desperate to find his missing love. 3 days after Joanne disappeared, on February 16, 2005, Paul Dyson agreed to do something that many families of missing persons do. He agreed to appear on local television to make a public appeal for information. The cameras were set up, the lights were positioned, and Paul Dyson, holding a handkerchief, sat down to tell his story to the public. Detective Superintendent Ray Higgins was watching that broadcast. He'd had no idea that Dyson was planning to make a television appeal. The media had arranged it independently, so when Paul Dyson's face appeared on the screen, Higgins paid close attention. In the morning, because I couldn't get Valentine's Day off, we swapped cards upstairs. Dyson said, his voice thick with emotion. I gave her a kiss and a cuddle, got ready for work. She was going to get her head down for another hour or so. I kissed her goodbye and went to work. That was it until I got home from work and she was not here. He spoke about how much Joanne meant to him. She's the only person I truly love, he said, his voice breaking. I want to know where she is. I want her back. I love her to bits, Dyson wept. She is 1 in a million and was always smiling. I need to know where she is, and that she is safe. If someone knows where she is, please let us know. And then Dyson said something peculiar, something that would be noted by reporters from the Independent. I just pray she is all right. He said, "There is no way I would do anything to harm her, and I don't know anyone who had a grudge." It was an odd thing to say, unprompted. Why would a concerned fiancé feel the need to explicitly state that he hadn't harmed his missing partner, unless some part of him felt defensive about it? But what really caught Detective Superintendent Higgins' attention wasn't what Paul Dyson said. It was what the cameras showed. As the broadcast continued, as Dyson sobbed and pleaded for Joanne's return, the camera operator zoomed in on his hands, and there, clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for, were two small crescent-shaped marks, one on the back of each of Paul Dyson's thumbs. Higgins sat forward. He knew exactly what those marks were. In the interview, there were two marks on his thumbs. Higgins would later explain, "I knew from dealing with previous assaults and murders that involved strangulation. The first thing a victim will do is try and pull those hands away from their neck. They were defensive wounds, self-inflicted injuries that occur when someone strangles another person and the victim claws at the attacker's hands, trying desperately to pull them away, to get air to survive. The fingernails dig into the flesh, leaving those distinctive crescent-shaped marks. Paul Dyson had strangled someone, and that someone Detective Superintendent Higgins strongly suspected was Joanne Nelson." The performance Dyson thought was so convincing had just revealed his guilt to the one person watching who knew how to read the signs. But Higgins needed more than suspicion. He needed proof. He needed Joanne's body. And he needed Dyson to make a mistake. Paul Dyson, for all his careful planning, couldn't live with what he'd done in silence. Maybe the weight of it was too much. Maybe he needed someone to know, to acknowledge what he'd done. Maybe he thought he could trust the person he chose to tell. He confided in a close friend, telling him what had really happened on Valentine's Day. He told him about the argument over laundry, about losing his temper, about strangling Joanne. He told him where he'd hidden her body, but that friend couldn't keep the secret. He went to someone he knew would do the right thing. Someone who might love Paul, but who loved the truth and justice more. He went to Paul's mother, Christine Dyson. When Christine Dyson heard what her son had done, she was horrified. This was the son she'd raised, the child she'd brought into the world. But she was also the wife of Peter Dyson, a man who had killed in a fit of rage. She'd seen what violence could do, how it could destroy lives and families, and she knew that some things, even the crimes of your own child, cannot be covered up or forgiven. On February 18th, 4 days after Joanne disappeared, Christine Dyson contacted the police. She told them that Paul had confessed to killing Joanne. She told them about the argument over laundry, about the strangulation, about the woods in North Yorkshire where he'd hidden the body. It was an act of extraordinary courage and moral clarity. Christine Dyson had turned in her own son. Paul was brought in for questioning. Under the weight of his mother's testimony and Detective Higgins' suspicions, his carefully constructed story began to unravel. He admitted he'd lied. He admitted he'd killed Joanne, but he claimed he couldn't remember where he'd left her body. This was almost certainly another lie. Detectives believed that Paul was hoping Joanne's body would never be found. Without a body, proving murder becomes much more difficult. There's always that shadow of doubt. Maybe she's still alive somewhere. Maybe she just left. Paul Dyson, it seemed, was hoping for that ambiguity, for that reasonable doubt that might save him. But Detective Superintendent Higgins wasn't going to let that happen. The search for Joanne's body intensified. Police had information from Christine Dyson about the general area, somewhere between West Hull and the River Ouse, up toward York near wooded areas. It was still a vast territory to search, but it narrowed the field. Days turned into weeks. The weather was terrible. Cold, wet, muddy. Search teams battled the elements as they combed through fields and woods, looking for any sign of Joanne. Then on March 24th, 2005, 6 weeks after Joanne disappeared, Detective Superintendent Ray Higgins and Detective Constable Phil Gadd were driving back from a meeting about the weekend searches. They were near the village of Bransby, off the B133063, when something caught their attention. A gate. A distinctive gate that matched a description they'd been given. Higgins and Gadd looked at each other. They pulled over and got out of the car. The woods near Bransby Lodge stretched out before them, quiet and still. They walked through that distinctive gate and into the woods. About 150 meters in, they saw something that didn't belong. an area where branches had been deliberately arranged, where pine needles and foliage seemed to be covering something. We immediately recognized the gate. Higgins would later say, "We walked through the woods, and we discovered what was clearly an attempt to conceal an object. They'd found her. They'd found Joanne. Her body was still wrapped in the bin liners. Paul Dyson had bought from the shop across from their home. The branches he'd used to cover her were still in place. She'd been there for over a month, hidden in that shallow grave, while Paul Dyson had wept crocodile tears on television and helped her family search for her." The discovery of Joanne's body changed everything. A post-mortem examination confirmed what Detective Higgins had suspected from those marks on Paul Dyson's thumbs. Joanne had been strangled to death with bare hands. Paul Dyson was formally charged with murder. The evidence was overwhelming: the testimony from his mother, the marks on his hands, the CCTV footage of him calmly buying supplies to hide the body, the forensic evidence linking him to the crime scene. Still, Dyson's lawyers prepared for trial. A date was set for November 7th, 2005. Joanne's family prepared themselves for the ordeal of sitting through a murder trial, of hearing the details of how their daughter and sister had died, of seeing Paul Dyson try to defend the indefensible. But when the trial began, something unexpected happened. The courtroom was packed. Members of Joanne's family sat in the public gallery, steeling themselves for what was to come. The judge took his seat. The prosecution prepared to present its case. And Paul Dyson, when asked to enter his plea, spoke only to confirm his name, and then said 2 words: "Guilty. Murder." He changed his plea. After months of lying, of maintaining he couldn't remember where Joanne's body was, of letting her family suffer through the uncertainty in the searches, Paul Dyson finally admitted what he'd done. The trial lasted just 30 minutes. There would be no prolonged ordeal for Joanne's family. No dragging them through the painful details in open court. They wouldn't have to testify. They wouldn't have to relive every moment of that terrible time. The court adjourned until the next day for sentencing. On November 8th, 2005, almost 10 months to the day since he murdered Joanne, Paul Dyson stood before Judge Tom Cracknell to learn his fate. The judge's words were precise and damning. "You lost your temper and throttled Joanne Nelson, a vivacious 22-year-old woman who you professed to love," Judge Cracknell said. "Having done so, you practiced upon her body hideous indignities. You tied her up, put her inside bin liners, bundled her into the boot of a car, and set off on a macabre and calculated journey to find a hiding place. You left her lying in a ditch. You went on TV and displayed a nauseating hypocrisy. You practiced this deception upon Joanne's family, leading them to think there may be some hope when there was none." Paul Dyson was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 16 years before he would be eligible for parole. As he was led away, Dyson showed no emotion, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the young life he'd stolen, the family he'd devastated, the future he'd destroyed. Joanne's family tried to move forward. Though how do you move forward from something like this? Charlie and Jean Nelson had lost their daughter in the most horrific way imaginable. Katie Nelson had lost her sister. They'd all been deceived by a man they'd welcomed into their family. A man who'd stood beside them searching for Joanne while knowing exactly where she was. Jenny Clark, Paul Dyson's ex-wife, saw his television appeal and immediately knew he was responsible. "I knew he had done it," she said, "because it was the same shameful expression I used to see. He was just feeling sorry for himself." The Crown Prosecution Service described Dyson's television appeals as stomach-churning. Body language experts who later analyzed the footage pointed out all the telltale signs and deception. The way he squeezed his eyes shut to force tears, the long eye closures, the careful control of his expressions. But for Joanne's family, the horror wasn't over. In October 2019, after 14 years in prison, Paul Dyson was moved to an open prison. This meant that for the final 2 years of his minimum sentence, he would be able to come and go, to work, to begin rebuilding his life. Katie Nelson, Joanne's sister, was devastated. "This man took my beautiful sister's life, thus completely destroying my parents' and my family's life," she said. After serving only 14 out of his 16-year prison sentence, he has been granted parole into an open prison for the remaining 2 years. An open prison is exactly that. He can come and go as he pleases, become employed and try to start a new life. The family had to relive their nightmare all over again, writing victim impact statements for the parole board, dredging up all the pain and trauma they'd tried so hard to process. And then in January 2022, 17 years after he murdered Joanne, Paul Dyson was released from prison. He'd served just 1 year more than his minimum sentence. He was a free man, walking the same streets as the family whose lives he'd destroyed. Katie Nelson spoke of her terror at the thought of accidentally bumping into him, of seeing the man who strangled her sister while going about her daily life. "It is heartbreaking," she said. "It's no time at all. To hear it was just sickening and unbelievable. I can't make sense of it." It would be easy to end this story focused on Paul Dyson, on the violence he committed, on the deception he practiced. But that's not how Joanne's story should end. Joanne G. Nelson was 22 years old when she died. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a colleague. She worked at the local job center, but dreamed of traveling the world, of making a difference, of experiencing life beyond the familiar streets of Hull. She was described as vivacious, always smiling, kind-hearted. She had plans, dreams, a future that should have stretched out before her for decades. She should have traveled to Ghana as a volunteer. She should have seen the world. She should have found real love with someone who cherished her, who would never have raised a hand to her in anger. Instead, her life was cut short by a man who claimed to love her, but who really loved only control, who came from a legacy of violence, and who perpetuated that legacy in the worst way imaginable. But Joanne's memory lives on in her family, in the people who loved her, in the community that rallied around her family in their darkest hours. She lives on in the stories they tell about her, in the photographs they keep, in the void her absence created that can never truly be filled. This is the tragedy of domestic violence. It doesn't just end one life. It shatters all the lives connected to that person. It steals not just the victim, but the future that victim should have had. The children they might have raised, the dreams they might have fulfilled, the people they might have touched with their kindness and their smile. Joanne Nelson deserved so much better than the end she got. She deserved a life full of adventure and love and possibility. Instead, she got a shallow grave in woods 50 miles from home, hidden under pine branches by the man who killed her. But she also deserves to be remembered not as a victim, not as a statistic, not as another name in the long, tragic litany of women killed by their partners. She deserves to be remembered as Joanne Vivacious, smiling, full of dreams. A young woman who should still be here, who should still be making her mark on the world. And so, as we close this chapter, as we let the darkness of this story fade into the background to let you rest, remember Joanne. Remember that behind every true crime story is a real person whose life mattered, whose absence leaves a hole in the world that can never be filled. Remember Joanne Nelson. Remember her smile. Remember her dreams. Remember that she deserved better. And let that be the final word. So if you're still awake, I'd like to know which of tonight's stories gave you chills the most. Was it the first story, the second, or the third? Meanwhile, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a case that shook Washington, D.C. in the spring of 2015. A story of betrayal, greed, and a family's final hours in their own home. This is the story of the D.C. mansion murder. The events I'm about to share with you are real. They happened in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in America's capital, just blocks from the vice president's residence. But before we begin, I want you to know that while this story is dark, my voice will stay with you, steady and calm as we walk through it together. Take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and let's begin. In the Woodley Park neighborhood of Northwest Washington, D.C., there stood a magnificent brick mansion on Woodland Drive. It was the kind of home that spoke of success, of the American dream realized. $4.5 million worth of history and elegance, with rooms that echoed with laughter and life. This was the home of the Savopoulos family. Savopoulos was 46 years old in the spring of 2015. He had grown up in Montgomery County, Maryland, part of a prominent Greek-American family. Those who knew him from his days at Springbrook High School and the University of Maryland remembered him as handsome, ambitious, and impossibly popular. He had what friends called a deep belly laugh, the kind that filled a room and made everyone around him smile. He was the kind of man who taught others how to have a good time while doing things right. Savas had married his high school and college sweetheart, Amy Martin. Amy was 47, beautiful and devoted to her family. Together they had built a life that seemed almost too perfect. 3 children, a thriving business, and a home filled with love. Savas had earned his law degree from American University, but his true calling was the family business. He became CEO of American Iron Works, a construction company based in Maryland that specialized in building large commercial and government structures. The company had even helped build the Verizon Center. Savas was known as a hands-on boss, the kind who liked to spend time with the welders and construction workers on job sites. Never too important to get his hands dirty. But Savas wasn't just about business. He was generous with both his time and his wealth. He helped fund the National Child Research Center and served on its board. He and Amy were active members of St. Sophia Greek Orthodox Cathedral. They were the kind of people who gave back, who believed in community, who believed in making the world better. Their son Philip was 10 years old. He had his father's passion and his mother's kindness. Philip loved go-kart racing with an intensity that amazed everyone who knew him. His coach would later describe him as passionate beyond belief. Amy and Savas followed Philip to all his races, completely devoted to supporting their son's dreams. They had 2 daughters as well, Abigail and Katerina. But in May of 2015, the girls were away at boarding school. The family employed a housekeeper named Vera Figueroa. Everyone called her Vera. She was 57 years old, hard-working and trusted. She had become more than just an employee to the Savopoulos family. She was part of their daily life, someone who cared for their home and their son with dedication and love. The family lived the kind of life most people dream about. They owned 5 luxury vehicles, including a blue Porsche 911. Their home was filled with beautiful things. Their calendar was full of Philip's races, charitable events, and family gatherings. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But in the spring of 2015, someone was watching that perfect life. Someone who had once worked for Savopoulos. Someone who had been fired years ago but had never forgotten. Someone who had nursed a grievance for a decade, letting it grow and fester and transform into something dark and dangerous. His name was Darren Wint. Darren Wint was born on November 27, 1980, in Guyana. He came to the United States as a teenager, settling in Prince George's County, Maryland, where there was a substantial Caribbean community. In 2000, when he was almost 20 years old, he tried to join the Marine Corps. He made it to boot camp, but was discharged for medical reasons before he could complete his training. Wint needed work, and he was trained as a certified welder. In 2003, he found employment at American Iron Works, where Savopoulos was CEO. For 2 years, Wint worked alongside other welders, and by some accounts, he and Savas had a friendly relationship. Some of Wint's family members would later claim the 2 men were friends. That Wint had even done some work at the Savopoulos mansion. But other workers at American Iron Works remembered something different. They remembered Wint as someone who couldn't get along with his co-workers, someone who made them feel uncomfortable, someone whose behavior became increasingly concerning. In 2005, everything came to a head. Wint threatened a co-worker with a knife. It was the kind of incident that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be explained away. Wint was fired. For most people, losing a job is difficult, but not insurmountable. You update your resume, you look for new opportunities, you move forward. But Darren Wint didn't move forward. Instead, something inside him seemed to crack. Over the next few years, Wint had trouble maintaining steady employment. He reached out to American Iron Works in 2008, asking to be rehired. He tried again in 2009. Both times he was turned away. His criminal record was growing. An assault on a girlfriend in 2009, a property destruction charge in 2010, after threatening to kill a woman and her infant daughter. And then there was the incident at the gas station. In 2010, 5 years after being fired, Wint was arrested at a gas station directly across the street from the American Iron Works headquarters. When police apprehended him, he was carrying a 2-foot-long machete and a BB pistol. The weapons charges were eventually dropped, and he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of possessing an open container of alcohol. But think about that for a moment. A gas station across the street from your former employer's headquarters, with weapons. What was he doing there? Was it coincidence? Or was he watching, waiting, planning? His own family had troubles with him too. In 2005, his father took out a protective order against him. There were other protective orders as well, issued by different people at different times. Darren Wint was a man who made people afraid. By 2015, Wint was 34 years old. He lived in an apartment complex in Lanham, Maryland, coincidentally less than half a mile from where the Savopoulos family would later park their luxury cars. For 10 years he had watched from a distance as Savopoulos continued to succeed, continued to thrive, continued to live the kind of life Wint would never have. 10 years is a long time to hold a grudge. A long time for anger to transform into something darker. A long time to plan. Wednesday, May 13th, 2015, started like any normal day for the Savopoulos family. Savas spent most of the day at his latest project, a martial arts studio he owned in Chantilly, Virginia. One of the family's housekeepers, Melissa Gutierrez, was there helping him. They were cleaning, organizing, getting the space ready. It was the kind of hands-on work Savas enjoyed, even though he could have easily hired someone else to do it. Around 5:30 that afternoon, Savas received a call from Amy. She asked him to come home because she had plans to go out that evening. She needed him to watch Philip. It was a simple request, the kind married couples make every day. Savas left the studio and headed home to their mansion on Woodland Drive. Philip was recovering from a concussion he'd gotten in a go-kart accident. He was supposed to be taking it easy, staying home, resting, so it made sense that he'd be at the house that evening while his mother went out. But Amy never went anywhere that night. Sometime around 6 o'clock that evening, something changed in the Savopoulos house. The normal rhythms of daily life were interrupted. Someone entered the home, someone who had been waiting for this opportunity, someone who had planned for this moment. There were no signs of forced entry at the front door. Whoever came into that house either had a key or the family let them in. Perhaps they knew them. Perhaps they trusted them. Later, investigators would find evidence suggesting someone had kicked in a side door, a boot print on the exterior, clear and deliberate. But by then it was too late. By then the nightmare had already begun. We don't know exactly when Darren Wint entered the Savopoulos home. We don't know if he came alone or if others helped him. What we do know is that at some point that evening, the Savopoulos family and their housekeeper Vera became prisoners in their own home. 4 people, a successful businessman, his wife, their 10-year-old son, and their housekeeper. Bound with duct tape, held hostage, trapped in rooms they had walked through freely just hours before. The family had 2 dogs, loyal pets who would have barked, who would have tried to protect their family, but the dogs were somehow kept quiet or removed. The house had security cameras, but Wint seemed to know about them, seemed to know how to avoid them or disable them. As darkness fell over Woodland Drive that Wednesday evening, the neighbors had no idea what was happening just doors away. No screams pierced the quiet street. No sounds of struggle alerted anyone that something was terribly wrong. The mansion sat there, looking just as peaceful and elegant as always. While inside its walls, a nightmare unfolded. Savopoulos was a wealthy man, but he didn't keep large amounts of cash at home. Wint knew this. He also knew that Savas had access to money through his business. So he had a plan. He would force Savas to get him cash. A lot of it. $40,000. But banks don't just hand out that kind of money without notice. You can't walk in and withdraw $40,000 on a whim. Arrangements have to be made. Time has to pass. And so Wint had to wait. He had to keep the family alive long enough for the money to be gathered and delivered. And he had leverage. The most powerful leverage imaginable. Philip. A 10-year-old boy who trusted his parents to keep him safe. The hours that followed were a special kind of torture. Imagine being bound to a chair in your own home. Your hands tied behind you, duct tape wrapped around your wrists and ankles. Your child nearby, also bound, also terrified. Every parent's worst nightmare playing out in real time, and you're completely helpless to stop it. Savopoulos had to make phone calls. He had to arrange for money to be withdrawn from his business accounts. He had to do it without raising suspicion, without alerting anyone that something was wrong. One wrong word, one hint of distress in his voice, and his family could pay the price. Around 8:30 that evening, Savas managed to contact his personal assistant, a young man named Jordan Wallace. Wallace was 28 years old, an aspiring race car driver who had been working for the Savopoulos family for only about 2 months. He had met the family at a go-kart racing facility where he worked as a coach, giving lessons to young Philip. When Wallace lost his job at the racing facility, Savas had generously offered him a position as a driver and personal assistant. Savas left Wallace a voicemail that evening. When you listen to it, and it would later be played in court, you hear something remarkable and heartbreaking. Savas sounds calm, friendly, upbeat. He even makes a joke about Wallace's outdated voicemail greeting. There's absolutely no hint of distress in his voice. No tremor, no code words. Nothing to suggest that as he made that call, he was being held hostage, his family bound and terrified around him. There's been a change of plans, Savas told Wallace in that message. He needed Wallace to come to the American Iron Works office in Hyattsville, Maryland, the next morning to pick up a package. Wallace got the message. He thought nothing of it. It was unusual, sure, but his boss was a wealthy man with a lot of business dealings. Who was he to question it? But inside the mansion, the night stretched on. Hours passed. The family remained bound. Wint had to keep them alive until the money came, but he couldn't let them go, couldn't let them be comfortable, couldn't let them forget who was in control. At some point during that long night, someone, probably Amy since she was the one at home, ordered pizza, 2 pizzas from Domino's. Pepperoni. The delivery driver brought the food to the house. He had no idea what was happening inside. He left the pizzas and drove away. Just another routine delivery on just another Wednesday night. Inside, someone ate that pizza. They were careless. They left crust behind. Evidence they couldn't even imagine would matter later. Philip was made to suffer. The specifics are almost too terrible to speak aloud. But investigators would later determine that the young boy was tortured. Not for information. What could a 10-year-old know? But to coerce his father, to break Savas's will, to make absolutely certain he would do whatever was demanded of him. Think about Savas in those hours. Hearing his son in pain, knowing that only his cooperation could end that suffering. Knowing that $40,000 an amount that would barely dent his wealth was all that stood between his family and freedom. How desperate he must have been to get that money, to give Wint what he wanted, to end the nightmare. And think about Amy, bound and helpless, unable to comfort her son, unable to protect him, and Vera, the housekeeper who happened to be there on the wrong day, who was caught up in violence not meant for her, who must have wondered why this was happening, what she had done to deserve this fate. The night wore on. Outside, the world continued its normal rhythms. People slept in their beds. Cars drove by on Woodland Drive. The moon moved across the sky, and inside the mansion, 4 people waited for morning, hoped for rescue that wasn't coming, prayed that money would save them. Dawn broke on Thursday, May 14th. For most people in Washington, D.C., it was just another spring morning, but for the Savopoulos family, it had been approximately 19 hours since their ordeal began. 19 hours of fear. 19 hours of being held captive. 19 hours that must have felt like an eternity. At 7 o'clock that morning, Savas called Jordan Wallace directly. Again, his voice was controlled. Calm, he told Wallace about delivering the package. Wallace agreed, thinking this was just another odd job from his wealthy employer. He had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Wallace met with Ted Chase, the chief financial officer of American Iron Works. That morning, Chase had withdrawn $40,000 in cash from the bank. 4 neat stacks of $100 bills. He handed the money to Wallace in a red bag. Wallace, seeing the enormous amount of cash, was amazed. He took a photograph of it and texted it to his girlfriend with a message. "My job is insane, don't tell anyone." He transferred the money from the red bag to a manila envelope in his car. Then he drove to the Savopoulos mansion on Woodland Drive. It was around 10:15 in the morning when Wallace arrived. He had been instructed to leave the money in one of the cars parked in the garage, specifically in the family's Porsche. He was told not to knock on the door. Savas was supposedly on an important conference call and would meet Wallace at work later. Wallace did exactly as he was told. He pulled up to the mansion, went into the garage, placed the envelope with $40,000 on the seat of the Porsche, and left. He saw no one, heard nothing unusual, had no idea that inside the house 4 people were bound and waiting, that a decade of grievance was about to reach its terrible conclusion. Wallace then drove to Chantilly, Virginia, to help finish the martial arts studio. He stopped at a hardware store. He worked on the studio, his phone's location data, security footage, and receipts would later confirm his whereabouts. He wasn't part of what happened next. He was just an unwitting participant. A young man who delivered money and drove away, not knowing he had just provided the final piece of a hostage situation. Back at the mansion, Darren Wint now had his $40,000. The family had cooperated. Savas had done everything that was demanded of him. He had gotten the money. He had followed every instruction. He had endured his son's suffering and his family's fear, but the money was never going to save them. Wint had entered that house with a plan that went beyond robbery. This wasn't about getting cash and leaving. This was about rage that had festered for 10 years. This was about a man who felt wronged, who believed he deserved what Savopoulos had, who couldn't let the family live to identify him, to testify, to bring him to justice. What happened next was methodical, brutal. The adults were beaten with a baseball bat, struck over and over. Savas was strangled. Vera was strangled. Amy suffered the same fate. The blunt force trauma alone would have been enough to kill them. But Wint made sure. He wanted there to be no doubt, no chance of survival, no mercy. Philip, that 10-year-old boy who loved go-karts and had his whole life ahead of him, was killed with what the medical examiner would describe as thermal and sharp force injuries. The fire was started in his bedroom, primarily in his room, with what investigators believed was gasoline. Philip died surrounded by flames. Then Wint set about covering his tracks. He doused the house with accelerant. He started fires in multiple locations. The beautiful mansion, the home where the Savopoulos family had built their life, became their funeral pyre. Wint took the keys to Amy's blue Porsche 911. He loaded the car with whatever else he could grab. And then he fled, leaving behind 4 bodies in a house that was beginning to fill with smoke. At some point that morning, someone from American Ironworks called Jordan Wallace. They told him the Savopoulos house was on fire. Wallace, confused and concerned, sent a text to Amy. "Hey Mib, it's Amy. Are you okay? If so, you need to get home. I got a call that your house is on fire." The text would never be read. Amy was already dead. The call came into the Washington, D.C. Fire Department just after noon on May 14th. A mansion was on fire in Woodley Park, one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. Firefighters rushed to the scene. Flames were visible from the street. Smoke poured from windows. It was the kind of fire that drew attention, that brought neighbors out of their homes to watch with horrified fascination. The firefighters fought the blaze with skill and determination. But as they made their way into the house, they began to discover something that transformed this from a fire scene into something far worse. Bodies. In the smoke and chaos and heat, firefighters found bodies. One of them had to crawl on the ground, feeling his way through the black smoke-filled rooms, touching something that he realized with horror was human remains. They pulled 3 bodies from a second-floor bedroom, 2 adults and 1 woman who would later be identified as Vera Figueroa, the housekeeper. But Vera was still alive when they found her. Barely. She was unconscious, severely injured, but clinging to life. They rushed her to the hospital. She died there, her suffering finally over. In another bedroom, they found Philip, the 10-year-old boy. The medical examiner would later determine that he had been stabbed and then burned. The fire had been most intense in his room, as if whoever started it wanted to make absolutely sure no one could investigate what had happened to him. Police quickly determined this was no ordinary house fire. The victims had been killed before the fire started, beaten, stabbed, strangled, and then burned. This was murder. This was intentional. This was planned. Detectives swarmed the scene. They cordoned off Woodland Drive. They began the grim work of processing a crime scene that was also a fire scene, where evidence had been damaged or destroyed by flames and water. They interviewed neighbors. They looked for witnesses. They tried to piece together what had happened. Who could have done this? And why? And that's when they found the pizza boxes. 2 Domino's pizza boxes, partially burned but still intact enough to be valuable. Inside one of them was a crust, a half-eaten slice of pepperoni pizza that someone had left behind. The fire hadn't completely destroyed it, and on that crust investigators found saliva, DNA. They ran the DNA through their databases, and they got a hit, a name, a person with a criminal record and a connection to the Savopoulos family, to Darren Wint. Once they had Wint's name, the investigation moved quickly. Detectives learned about his employment at American Iron Works. They learned about his firing in 2005 after threatening a coworker with a knife. They learned about his criminal history, the assaults, the threats, the protective orders. They learned about the 2010 arrest across from American Iron Works. With a machete and BB gun, a pattern emerged. This wasn't a random home invasion. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was targeted. This was workplace violence. A decade in the making. This was a grievance collector who had spent years nursing his anger, letting it grow, planning his revenge. Police found more evidence. Wint's DNA was discovered on a bright green construction vest found in the burned-out Porsche. Amy's blue Porsche 911 had been driven to a church parking lot in New Carrollton, Maryland, less than half a mile from where Wint lived, and set on fire that same afternoon. The vest had been left inside. Detectives also found evidence of a possible knife in the basement of the burned house, with DNA linking it to Wint. Duct tape recovered from the driveway, a hair sample, and a piece of bedding. Each piece of evidence built the case. But where was Wint? On May 19th, 5 days after the murders, police publicly identified Darren Wint as a suspect. His photo was released to the media. He was declared armed and dangerous. Authorities warned that he should not be approached. The manhunt began. We knew the police were coming. In the aftermath of the murders, while investigators were still processing the scene, Wint had been busy. He performed a series of internet searches on his phone. How to beat a lie detector test. 10 hideout cities for fugitives. 5 countries with no U.S. extradition treaty. He knew what he'd done. He knew he needed to run. He fled to Brooklyn, New York. U.S. Marshals tracked him there through his girlfriend's phone. They almost caught him, but he slipped away. He knew they were close. According to his girlfriend, he was thinking about turning himself in, but he didn't turn himself in. Instead, he came back to the area. Maybe he thought he could hide in plain sight. Maybe he needed money or help from family. Maybe he just couldn't stay away. On May 21st, 2015, 7 days after the murders, a massive law enforcement operation tracked Wint to a Howard Johnson Express Inn in College Park, Maryland. He was in a Chevrolet with 2 women. In the car, police found $7,000 in cash and what appeared to be a large stack of $100 bills. In a box truck behind the car, they found Wint's younger brother Daryl and other friends. They had $13,000 in money orders. It appeared they might have been helping Wint flee, though none of them would ever be charged. When police stopped the vehicles and arrested Wint, he had a BB pistol and a machete with him. Even after everything, after the murders, after the manhunt, he was still armed with weapons. He was taken into custody without incident. The chase was over. Darren Wint was charged with 20 felony counts, including 12 counts of first-degree murder, while armed with aggravating circumstances. The prosecution's case was comprehensive, but it centered on that pizza crust, that one piece of careless evidence that Wint had left behind. For 3 years, the case wound through the court system. Wint's legal representation changed several times. He waived his right to a speedy trial. Delays mounted. But finally, in September 2018, the trial began. It was expected to last 2 months and involve testimony from more than 60 witnesses. The prosecution presented a devastating case. The DNA evidence alone was powerful. Wint's DNA on the pizza crust on the construction vest, possibly on other items at the scene. They showed Wint's internet search history, those desperate queries about how to evade justice. They presented the $40,000 found in his possession when he was arrested. They showed his connection to American Iron Works, his firing, his criminal history. They described the 19 hours of captivity, the torture, the beating with a baseball bat, the strangulation, the stabbing, the fire. They played Savopoulos' voicemail to Jordan Wallace, that heartbreaking message where he sounded calm and normal even as he was being held hostage. They showed the jury the burned rooms, the evidence of violence, the locations where each victim was found. But the defense had a different story. In their opening statement, they made a shocking claim. Darren Wint's brothers did it. His 2 brothers, Stefan and Daryl, had actually committed the murders while Wint remained downstairs. Unaware, the brothers had set him up, they argued. They had deceived him. and they had help from Jordan Wallace, Savas' assistant. The defense pointed out that Wallace had lied to police about details of the money delivery. They noted he'd taken a photo of the cash and sent it to his girlfriend. They suggested he had connections to one of Wint's brothers. They implied he might have shared information about the house's security systems. They also argued that DNA from siblings can be similar, that a single hair couldn't definitively prove Wint had been upstairs where the murders occurred. They tried to create doubt, to suggest that maybe, just maybe, Wint was a patsy set up by his own family. But Darren Wint himself testified against his brother. He provided an alibi for the time frame of the crime. He told the jury what he knew, and the prosecutors reminded the jury that even if others helped, and if there were accomplices, this trial was about Darren Wint and his involvement in these murders. Jordan Wallace took the stand. By then he was 31 years old. He had been living with the weight of this for 3 years, knowing he had unwittingly delivered the ransom money that probably sealed the family's fate. When Savas' voicemail was played in court, Wallace broke down crying. He had cared about the Savopoulos family. They had been kind to him, and his last interaction with them had been dropping off money they had desperately hoped would save their lives. The trial continued for nearly 6 weeks. Witness after witness testified. The surviving Savopoulos daughters, Abigail and Katerina, were present. They had been away at boarding school when their parents and brother were murdered. They sat in the courtroom and stared at Darren Wint, the man accused of destroying their family. One of them took notes throughout the testimony, watching his every move. On October 25, 2018, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty on all 20 counts. 12 counts of first-degree murder, while armed. 4 counts of felony murder in the course of kidnapping. 4 counts of felony murder in the course of burglary, kidnapping, extortion, theft, arson. When the verdict was read, Savas' father, the elder Philip Savopoulos, who had lost his son, daughter-in-law, and grandson, broke down. Family members comforted each other, tears streaming down their faces. 3 years of waiting, of reliving the nightmare, of hoping for justice had finally reached this moment. On February 1st, 2019, Judge Juliet McKenna sentenced Darren Wint to 4 consecutive life terms in prison, with no possibility of release. He would never leave prison. He would never again walk free. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying for those 19 hours of terror and 4 innocent lives taken. The Savopoulos mansion stood empty after the murders. It was a crime scene, then just a burned shell, then a reminder of tragedy that no one wanted to see. Eventually, it was demolished. The lot was cleared. The house where a family had lived, and loved and died, was erased from the landscape, though it could never be erased from memory. In January 2018, the property went back on the market for $4.5 million. Just an empty lot now. Some people thought about buying it, about building something new there. But how do you build on ground soaked with that much pain? How do you look out windows where other windows once framed such horror? The Savopoulos family released statements thanking law enforcement for bringing Darren Wint to justice. But justice, they knew, was a limited comfort. Justice couldn't bring back Savas or Amy or Philip. Justice couldn't return Vera to her family. Justice couldn't restore what had been lost. The 2 surviving daughters had to rebuild their lives around a hole that could never be filled. They had lost their parents and their brother. The family that had been so close, so loving, so devoted to each other, had been torn apart in a single day. The community was shaken. Woodley Park, that affluent neighborhood where people felt safe, where violence wasn't supposed to happen, had been violated. Residents installed more security systems. They looked at their neighbors differently. They wondered who might be watching, who might be nursing grievances, who might be planning something terrible. And there were questions that would never be fully answered. Had Wint acted alone, or did he have help? What really happened during those 19 hours? Were there accomplices who were never caught? How did he know so much about the house? About the family's routines? One investigator noted something troubling. In the 8 months before the murders, Wint had used his cell phone to conduct searches. But there was no record of him searching for the Savopoulos family's address, or directions to their home. He knew where they lived. He knew how to get there. He knew when to strike. How? The theory was that Wint had been watching for years. Maybe that arrest in 2010 at the gas station across from American Ironworks wasn't just about drinking alcohol. Maybe it was surveillance. Maybe he had been following Savas, learning his patterns, tracking him from work to home. Maybe he had spent years planning, waiting for the right moment. It's a terrifying thought that someone could harbor hatred for so long, could plan violence for years, could watch and wait and prepare while living what appeared to be a normal life. Workplace violence experts call people like Wint grievance collectors. They hold on to perceived wrongs. They nurture anger. They move through a pathway toward violence that can take months or years or even decades. If there's a lesson in this tragedy, it might be about taking threats seriously, about not minimizing concerning behavior, about understanding that anger, when left to fester, can transform into something monstrous. Wint had threatened people. He had been violent before. He had been arrested with weapons outside his former workplace. All the warning signs were there, scattered across years of his life. But hindsight is always clearer than foresight. The Savopoulos family couldn't have known. How could they? Savas was generous. He had hired people who needed work. He had given Wint's family chances at American Ironworks. He had been the kind of boss who worked alongside his employees. He hadn't wronged Wint. He had simply fired someone who had threatened another worker, which was what any responsible employer would do. The unfairness of it all is perhaps the hardest part. Good people, living good lives, being good to their community, raising their children with love and supporting their dreams. And in 19 hours, it was all destroyed by one man's rage and greed, and decade-old grievance. Take a breath. Let it out slowly. The story of the DC Mansion murders is over now. Darren Wint is in prison. The investigation is closed. The trial has concluded. Justice, in its limited way, has been served. But somewhere, two young women, Abigail and Katerina Savopoulos, continue to live with the loss of their family. Every holiday without their parents. Every milestone without their little brother. Every memory tinged with the knowledge of how it ended. And in homes across America, families go about their lives, unaware of who might be watching, who might be remembering, who might be planning. The case reminds us that evil sometimes wears a familiar face. That danger can come from someone who once worked for you, who you treated fairly, who you tried to help. That doing the right thing, like firing someone who threatened others, doesn't always protect you from consequences. But it also reminds us of love. The Savopoulos family loved each other deeply. They supported Philip's dreams. They gave back to their community. They were devoted to each other until the very end. Savas endured unimaginable torment, trying to save his family. Amy stayed with her son. They faced their final hours together, as a family. And Vera, loyal Vera, who was simply doing her job, caring for a home and the people in it. She deserves to be remembered too. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't famous. She was a hard-working woman who showed up that day not knowing it would be her last. Her life mattered just as much as the others. The National Child Research Center, where Savas had served on the board, established the Savopoulos Family Foundation in honor of the family. Their legacy of generosity and community service continues. Even though they're gone, Philip's go-kart racing community mourned him deeply. His coach said Philip had taught him about passion, about dedication, about loving something so much you give it everything you have. That's how Philip approached racing. That's how the Savopoulos family approached life. The Greek Orthodox community in Washington held services. Hundreds attended the funerals. The pews were filled with people whose lives had been touched by this family's kindness and generosity. In death as in life, the Savopoulos family brought people together. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're traveling to Queensland, Australia, to a small rural town called Gin Gin, where in May 2025 a 17-year-old girl named Fobi Bishop vanished on what should have been the happiest day of her young life. This is a story about hope and heartbreak, about a journey that never happened, and about the darkness that can hide in the most ordinary places. Fobi Bishop was 17 years old, though those who knew her would tell you she seemed older in some ways, younger in others. She stood tall at nearly 6 feet, with a pale complexion that freckled in the Queensland sun, and long hair she dyed a vivid shade of red. Her hazel eyes, her mother would later say, were always searching for something beautiful to capture, some moment worth remembering. Her mother, Kylie Johnson, described Phoebe as strong-willed, someone who followed her own beat through life. She had affectionate nicknames that her family used. Fifi, Nanny McPhee, sometimes just Flea Flea. She was an aunt to little Tallulah, a sister to Jamie, Jessie, Kaylee, Ruby Lay, and Ibel. She loved the outdoors with a passion inherited from both sides of her family. From her grandfather and father, she got her love of cars. From her mother and brothers, she inherited a deep appreciation for four-wheel driving and camping under open skies. Phoebe had dreams of becoming a photographer. She wanted to capture the world through a lens, to frame moments of beauty and preserve them forever. It was a gentle ambition for someone who friends described as having a gentle soul and a generous spirit. Someone who always stood up for what was right, who cared deeply for others. But in May 2025, Phoebe wasn't living the life she dreamed of. She was staying in a decrepit house in Gin, a rural town about 50 kilometers west of Bundaberg, in a property that neighbors would later describe with barely concealed disgust. The house reeked. Dead animals had been found inside, 4 dogs by some accounts, up to 13 by others. Rubbish was stacked throughout the rooms. It was by all accounts a place of neglect and decay. She shared this house with 2 people, James Wood, a 34-year-old man, and Tinika Bromley, a 33-year-old woman. Bromley had a connection to Phoebe's family. She had once worked for Phoebe's mother, Kylie, before being made redundant in 2024. How Phoebe came to be living in that house, with those people in those conditions, was a question that would haunt her family in the weeks to come. But Phoebe had something to look forward to. She had hope. She had a reason to save every dollar she could scrape together. She had someone waiting for her, 3,500 kilometers away, across the vast Australian continent. She had Levi. His name was Levi, and he was 18 years old. He lived in Western Australia now, but he hadn't always. He and Phoebe had been high school sweethearts, back when life was simpler, back before tragedy struck his family. On New Year's Eve in 2020, Levi's mother had been killed in a car accident. The crash site was on a road the children passed every single day on the school bus. Every morning, every afternoon, they would ride past the place where their mother had died. Levi's father, Rick, couldn't bear it anymore. He couldn't bear watching his children relive that trauma twice a day, 5 days a week. So he made the difficult decision to move his family across the country to Western Australia, hoping distance might help heal wounds that time alone couldn't mend. But Levi never forgot Phoebe, and Phoebe never forgot him. Despite the thousands of kilometers between them, they maintained their relationship with the devotion only young love can sustain. Levi's father, Rick, would later describe their connection to reporters with a mixture of affection and heartbreak. They would video chat every single night, he said. They would fall asleep together, screens glowing in dark rooms on opposite sides of Australia, and the next day they would tell each other who had been sleep-talking. For months, Phoebe had been saving money for a plane ticket. Every dollar mattered. She was determined to see Levi, to be with him, to escape that awful house in Gin, even if only for a little while. And Levi, for his part, had been planning too. He'd saved up and bought Phoebe a gift, a Canon camera worth $1,000, because she wanted to get into photography. He'd packed his 4-wheel drive with camping gear. He'd planned a trip to Esperance on Western Australia's south coast, where they would camp on the beach together, just the 2 of them, under stars that stretched from horizon to horizon. Rick would later tell reporters how excited both teenagers had been. So heartbreaking, he would say, seeing what could have been a beautiful future together shattered into pieces. On May 14th, 2025, Phoebe made her last known bank transaction. The next day, May 15th, she would finally board that plane. She would finally see Levi. After all the video calls, all the sleep-talking, all the planning and saving and dreaming, they would finally be together again. That was the plan. But plans, as we know, don't always work out the way we hope. The morning of May 15th dawned like any other in Gin. The sun rose over the rural Queensland landscape, casting long shadows across empty roads and quiet properties. Inside that rundown house, Fobi Bishop was preparing for her journey. She packed her luggage. She put on a green tank top and gray sweatpants, comfortable clothes for a long day of travel. She had her red hair pulled back. She was ready. James Wood and Tanika Bromley, her housemates, offered to drive her to Bundaberg Airport in Bromley's gray Hyundai X35. It wasn't far, about 50 kilometers. An easy drive. Fobi accepted. She climbed into the vehicle with her luggage, her dreams packed as carefully as her clothes. At approximately 8:30 that morning, CCTV cameras captured that gray Hyundai near Airport Drive in Bundaberg, close to the terminal. Fobi Bishop was inside that car. She had her luggage. She was wearing that green tank top and those gray sweatpants. She was so close to that flight, so close to Brisbane, so close to Perth, so close to Levi and that camera and that beach at Esperance. Around that same time, 8:30 in the morning, Fobi made one final phone call to Levi. They spoke. Perhaps she told him she was almost there. Perhaps she told him she loved him. Perhaps she said she'd see him soon. We don't know what they said to each other in those last moments. What we know is that after that call ended, Fobi's phone was switched off. It has remained silent ever since. Fobi Bishop never entered the Bundaberg Airport terminal. CCTV footage would later confirm this. She never checked in for her flight to Brisbane. She never boarded that plane. She never landed in Perth. And in Western Australia, Levi waited at the Perth airport, checking the arriving flights again, and again watching passengers emerge from gates, searching the crowd for red hair and hazel eyes. He waited until it became clear that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Fobi Bishop had vanished. On May 16th, the day after Fobi disappeared, Queensland police issued a missing person alert. The message went out across the region. Fobi Bishop, 17 years old, approximately 180 centimeters tall, pale complexion, long red-dyed hair, hazel eyes, last seen carrying luggage, wearing a green tank top and gray sweatpants. Fobi's mother, Kylie Johnson, took to social media with desperate appeals. If anyone has seen or heard from Fobi, please contact the police, she begged. Over 400 missing person posters were distributed across the Wide Bay region, plastered on shop windows, telephone poles, community boards. Fobi's face stared out from those posters, her red hair bright, her expression hopeful, frozen in a moment before she disappeared. Police declared 2 crime scenes. The first was the property in Gingin, where Fobi had been living with Wood and Bromley. The second was that gray Hyundai X35, registration 4040 UD. Detective Acting Inspector Ryan Thompson held a press conference. "We do hold concerns for her safety," he said. "It has been nearly a week since she was last sighted, and it's out of character for her not to make any contact with anyone." But Thompson was careful with his words. "Just because we are deeming this suspicious doesn't mean anything sinister has happened," he said, though his tone suggested he feared otherwise. The investigation focused initially on Airport Drive and the Samuels Road area in Bundaberg, then expanded to Gingin. Police appealed for dashcam footage for any sightings of that gray Hyundai between May 15th and 18th. James Wood and Tanika Bromley, Fobi's housemates, spoke to officers. They cooperated. The police said, at that stage there were no persons of interest. As the days passed, Kylie Johnson's social media posts became increasingly anguished. "As another day starts, it's getting harder to breathe," she wrote. "And the numbness that we feel at the not knowing is eating at us. We would do anything just to hear your voice, to have you curl up in my lap and hold you tight with your wild, crazy hair in my face, annoying my nose. I have no words to describe what this is doing to our family, to our friends, and to our community." On May 23rd, 8 days after Fobi vanished, the search expanded dramatically. Phone data had led investigators to Goodnight Scrub National Park, an hour's drive from Bundaberg Airport. Homicide detectives were called in. Police divers combed waterways. Cadaver dogs searched the dense bushland. Drones flew overhead, cameras scanning the unforgiving terrain below. Detective Acting Inspector Thompson told reporters they had recovered some items of interest, though he wouldn't specify what. He mentioned telecommunications data, snippets of information, and he said something that sent a chill through everyone following the case. There was reason to believe evidence might have been moved from the national park before investigators arrived. Someone, it seemed, had been there first. By May 26, Queensland Premier David Crisafulli publicly expressed concern about the case. The story was now making national headlines. A 17-year-old girl had disappeared on her way to see her boyfriend. She had simply vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. Starting day 20 with you still missing, Fiobio. Kylie wrote on June 3rd, I don't know if life will ever be the same again. I don't know if I will ever look at the world the same way that I did before May 15th. What I do know is that people have information on where you are, Fio, and we need that reported to police. There was a note of accusation in those words now, a growing certainty that someone knew something. Someone was keeping a terrible secret. On June 4th, 20 days after Phoebe disappeared, police announced they were suspending the physical search. The news hit the community hard. Had they given up? Were they abandoning Phoebe? But that same day, James Wood was arrested. He was taken into custody for questioning regarding Phoebe's disappearance. Hours later, he was released without charge. The investigation, police said, was ongoing. The next day, June 5th, exactly 3 weeks after Phoebe vanished, everything changed. That evening, police arrested both James Wood and Tanika Bromley in the Bundaberg area. Both were charged with 1 count of murder and 2 counts of interfering with a corpse. The charges sent shockwaves through Queensland. Interfering with a corpse, the plural was chilling. Police alleged that Phoebe's body had been moved not once, but twice. The remains of Fobi Bishop have not been located to date, Queensland police said in their statement that night. Detectives continue to investigate this matter, and physical searches will continue as needed as information is provided. Police body cam footage would later be released, showing the moment of Wood's arrest. An officer told him calmly that he was being taken into custody over the homicide of Fobi Bishop. Wood's face showed little emotion. It emerged that both Wood and Bromley had already been charged with unrelated weapons offenses. Police had found a shortened firearm, ammunition, and 2 replica handguns in their car in their home. The house where Phoebe had been living was revealed to be even worse than neighbors had suggested, not just neglected but dangerous, filled with weapons and death. On June 6th, Wood and Bromley made their first court appearance at Bundaberg Magistrates Court. They did not appear in person, but were represented by lawyers. Both were remanded in custody. Their next court appearance was set for August 11th. Outside the courthouse, Phoebe's sister Kaylee Bishop faced reporters, her voice breaking. She was flanked by supporters, locals holding signs. If you've got any information about Phoebe or the car, or anything like that, just come forward, Kaylee said. 3 weeks is too long for us as a family and all of her friends. We just want her home. She was loved and she's missed dearly. That afternoon, police made another announcement. They had found something. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, on June 6th, police located human remains during a search of an area near Goodnight Scrub National Park, southwest of Bundaberg. The remains were found on a back road surrounded by dense bushland, not too far from the original search area. As Detective Inspector Craig Mansfield would later say, the remains have not been buried. They lay exposed in that harsh Queensland landscape, hidden only by the scrub in the distance from any traveled road. Police established a crime scene. Forensic teams moved in. The painstaking work of formal identification began. Kylie Johnson learned the news before it became public. On her Facebook page, she wrote words that no mother should ever have to write. I didn't think my heart could break any more than it did when you went missing, or when the charges were laid, but this is ripping me apart. On June 17th, 11 days after the discovery, Queensland police released the official confirmation. The remains found near Goodnight Scrub National Park had been positively identified as belonging to Fobi Bishop. She was 17 years old. She had been dead since May 15th. The day she was supposed to fly to see her boyfriend, the day she'd made that final phone call, the day she disappeared. Police believed they understood the motive, though they weren't sharing it publicly. They alleged that Phoebe had been killed shortly after she was recorded on Airport Drive that morning at 8:30. They alleged that her body had been moved on May 15th, the day of her death, and then moved again 2 days later on May 17th. Phoebe's luggage has never been found. Her phone has never been recovered. These missing pieces of evidence suggest someone went to considerable effort to hide what happened, to erase the traces of her final journey. A third person was arrested in connection with the case. Someone who allegedly used Phoebe's phone to interfere with the investigation. This person has not been named publicly, but the charge suggests someone tried to create false trails, to mislead investigators, to buy time for Wood and Bromley. The evidence against them was mounting. Detective Inspector Mansfield told the media that telecommunications data and information from various sources had led them to the location where Fiobe's body was found. Sergeant Kennedy Grills would later tell the court that the brief of evidence was extensive. CCTV footage, telephone and message data, photographs, post-mortem documents, and outstanding DNA and ballistics reports. The sheer volume of evidence, he said, along with the number of crime scenes involved, was causing delays in bringing the case to trial. On June 8th, 2 days after Fiobe's remains were found, a candlelight vigil was held at Kolen Community Park in Jinjin. Hundreds of people gathered as the sun set, holding candles that flickered in the evening breeze. They came to remember Fiobe, to show support for her devastated family, and to grieve together for a young life cut brutally short. Kylie Johnson attended the vigil, though her heart was shattered. She stood before the crowd and did something remarkable. She asked them for peace, not just for her family, but for the families of the accused as well. Fiobe's compassion would have reached that depth, she said. It is imperative to us that her legacy is not one of blame and bitterness. Fiobe's cousin, Whitney Woodfield, also spoke. She issued a plea on behalf of the family, asking people to stop the online harassment and wild conspiracy theories that had been circulating. Some people, in their grief and anger, had been targeting Kylie, suggesting she bore some responsibility for Fiobe's death. Whitney made it clear, Fiobe wouldn't want anyone blaming her mom, her sister, or the rest of the family. We are exhausted and broken. On June 16th, 10 days after Fiobe's remains were found, her friends and community organized a memorial convoy. More than 50 vehicles, cars, trucks, four-wheel drives gathered in Jinjin, then drove together through South Kolen and Sharon, making their way to Bundaberg Regional Airport, the place Fiobe had been heading that terrible morning. People lined the roads, waving, cheering, showing their love. The convoy participants wore t-shirts emblazoned with bright butterflies and the words "Forever 17" and "In loving memory of Fiobe." Bundy showed up in full force, one photographer posted on Facebook, and the love could be felt everywhere. Kylie Johnson wrote afterward, "My Fifi would have loved this. Thank you for the love, acceptance, and support you all showed today." June 30th. A funeral service was held for Fiobe in Bundaberg, followed by a private cremation at Springfield's crematorium at Elliott Heads. The funeral notice read, Bishop, Fiobe Jade Nanny McPhee, aged 17 years. Late of Jinjin and formerly of Windsor, NOSW. Beloved daughter of Kylie and Ray, Kevin and Stacy. Dearly loved sister of Jamie, Jesse, Kaylee. Ruby Lee, Ibel, and sister-in-law to Gianni. Loving auntie to Talola. Much loved niece, cousin, and friend to many. In lieu of flowers, the family asked for donations to Fiobe's GoFundMe page, which had been organized by Tracy Behrens to help with funeral costs. Fiobe had a gentle soul and a generous spirit, Behrens wrote, always caring for others and standing up for what was right. Across the country in Western Australia, Levi was trying to process a grief too large for his young shoulders. His father, Rick, spoke to reporters about his son's pain. He's still traumatized, Rick said. This was the second major tragedy Levi had experienced in just 5 years. First his mother's death in that car crash, and now Fiobe. That $1,000 camera Levi had bought still sat somewhere. Unused, intended for hands that would never hold it. That camping trip to Esperance would never happen. Those beach sunrises would never be photographed. All those plans, all that careful saving, all that teenage hope and excitement, all of it had died on a road near Bundaberg on the morning of May 15th. Rick described the relationship his son had shared with Fiobe. They would video chat all night, every night, falling asleep, and then they would tell each other who was sleep-talking the next day. It was such an intimate detail, such a simple expression of young love. Two teenagers separated by an entire continent, finding comfort in each other's virtual presence, falling asleep together with glowing screens as their only connection. And now Levi sleeps alone. Now there's silence where Fiobe's voice used to be. Rick's words echo with the father's helpless pain. It's so heartbreaking, seeing what could have been a beautiful future together shattered into pieces. As this story draws to a close, many questions remain unanswered. The case against James Wood and Tonica Bromley is still working its way through the Queensland justice system. Their next court appearance, initially scheduled for August 2025, has been delayed due to the complexity and volume of evidence. Neither has entered a plea. Both remain in custody. What exactly happened in that gray Hyundai on the morning of May 15th? Why did Fobi never make it into the airport terminal when she was so close? What was the motive that police claim to understand but won't reveal publicly? Why was her body moved twice? Where are her luggage and her phone? Perhaps most haunting of all, could this have been prevented? Fobi was living in conditions that neighbors described as deplorable. Wood and Bromley had weapons in their home, illegal weapons. They had dead animals throughout the property. These were warning signs of dysfunction and danger. Yet Fobi remained there, trapped by circumstances we may never fully understand. Her mother, Kylie, had hired Bromley as an employee before making her redundant in 2024. Was there resentment there? Was there some perceived debt or obligation that led to Fobi staying in that house? These are speculations, connections that may mean nothing, or may mean everything. What we know with certainty is this. On May 15th, 2025, a 17-year-old girl with red hair and dreams of becoming a photographer disappeared on her way to see the boy she loved. Her housemates are accused of murdering her and moving her body to hide the evidence of their crime. Her remains were found 3 weeks later in Bushland, and a third person allegedly used her phone to mislead the investigation. We know that her mother's heart is broken beyond repair. We know that her sister stood on courthouse steps and begged for information. We know that her boyfriend waited at an airport for a plane that would never arrive. We know that more than 50 vehicles drove through rural Queensland roads in her memory, and hundreds of people held candles in the gathering dark. We know that Fobi Bishop will be forever 17. Frozen in time at the very moment when her life was about to change. When adventure and love and photography and beach camping were all just a plane ride away. The legal process will continue. Evidence will be presented. Witnesses will testify. Eventually there may be a trial, and perhaps there will be convictions, and perhaps James Wood and Tanika Bromley will spend the rest of their lives in prison for what they're accused of doing. But none of that will bring Fobi back. None of it will undo that morning of May 15th. None of it will put that Canon camera in her hands, or let her watch a sunrise over Esperance Beach with the boy who loved her. Before we end tonight, there's something important to remember about cases like this. True crime isn't just about murder and mystery. It's about the ripples that spread outward from a single act of violence, touching hundreds of lives, changing communities forever. Shenzhen is a small town. Everyone knew everyone. Now they all know what happened in that house on their street. They all remember those searches, those missing person posters, those desperate days hoping Fobi would be found alive. They all carry a piece of this tragedy with them. Fobi's family has asked that her legacy not be one of blame and bitterness. They want her remembered for her gentle soul, her generous spirit, her love of the outdoors, her passion for standing up for what was right. They want people to remember Nanny McPhee, Fifi Flea Flea, a girl who made her family laugh, who was a devoted aunt to little Talaya, who spent hours on video calls with her boyfriend, falling asleep to the sound of his breathing 3,000 kilometers away. If there's a lesson in this terrible story, perhaps it's this. Pay attention to the vulnerable people around you. Notice when someone is living in conditions no one should have to endure. Speak up when something feels wrong. Ask questions when a friend seems trapped in a bad situation. Sometimes the difference between life and death is as simple as someone caring enough to intervene, to offer help, to provide an escape route. Fobi was trying to escape. She had saved for months for that plane ticket. She was so close. She was wearing her green tank top and gray sweatpants, carrying her luggage, just 50 kilometers from the airport, just hours from Brisbane, just a connecting flight from Perth, just a car ride from Levi's arms and that beach, and that camera and that future that should have been hers. She was so close. And that's perhaps the most heartbreaking part of all. If you or someone you know is in a dangerous living situation, please reach out for help. There are resources available, people who care, ways to escape before it's too late. Remember Fobi Bishop. Remember that she was loved. Remember that she mattered. Remember that her life had value beyond this tragedy. Rest well, Fobi. Forever 17. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time. ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.